It costs more to outfit a single Portuguese caravel for one voyage to India than a farmer in Lisbon will earn in 3 lifetimes. Let that sink in. Somewhere in the harbour at sunrise, while merchants sleep in their beds, 30 men load provisions onto a wooden ship. They carry barrels of salted meat. They haul casks of wine as water. They stack hardtack biscuits that will turn to dust before the voyage ends. They coil rope thick as a man's arm. They load spare canvas for sails that will tear in storms they cannot yet imagine. The ship itself cost more than most of these men will see in their entire lives, and it may never return. Tonight, we go on that voyage. Not as sailors, as economists. We will count every ducat spent. We will weigh every risk calculated. We will trace every gold coin from the king's treasury to the ship's hold to the bottom of the sea or the markets of Calicut. And we will learn a simple truth. The age of exploration was not about adventure. It was about money. It was the largest, riskiest, most expensive investment project human civilization had ever attempted. And for a brief window of time, it generated returns so staggering that they reshaped the world. This is the economics of sailing beyond the edge of the known world. This is the story of the people who counted the cost and sailed anyway. To understand why anyone would spend a fortune on wooden ships and uncertain seas, we need to understand the world that made such risk seem reasonable. The year is 1497. Europe sits at the edge of something it has wanted for centuries but cannot reach. Spices. Not just any spices. The spices of Asia, pepper from India, cloves from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from a handful of tiny islands most Europeans could not locate on any map. These substances were worth more than silver, in some years worth more than gold. Why did spices matter so much? Start with food preservation. There was no refrigeration in 1497. Meat slaughtered in autumn had to last through winter. Salt helped, but salt alone made food barely edible. Pepper, cinnamon, and other spices masked the taste of meat going bad. They made winter provisions something a wealthy family could actually bear to eat. Then medicine. Medieval and Renaissance physicians believed spices had curative properties. Cloves for toothache, ginger for digestion, cinnamon for everything from coughs to plague. Whether these treatments worked or not, people believed they worked, and belief created demand, then status. A merchant who could afford to season his food with pepper was showing everyone at his table that he had money. A noble who served guests dishes flavoured with cloves and nutmeg was demonstrating power. Spices were visible, tastable proof of wealth. The demand was enormous, but the supply was controlled by others. Spices grew in Asia, thousands of miles from Europe. They travelled overland along routes controlled by Islamic merchants and the Ottoman Empire. Each middleman along the way added costs. Each border crossing meant tariffs and taxes. Each city's market meant merchants taking their share. By the time pepper grown in India reached a market in Venice or Genoa, it had passed through a dozen hands. Its price had multiplied 10 times, 20 times, sometimes 40 times what it cost at the source. A pound of pepper that sold for the equivalent of 1 silver coin in Calicut might cost 10 silver coins in Cairo, 20 in Venice, 40 in London. The markup was staggering. European merchants saw this and understood the mathematics immediately. If they could reach Asia directly, if they could sail there themselves, buy spices at the source, and bring them back, they could keep all those middle profits for themselves. But there was a problem. No one knew how to get there by sea. The Mediterranean routes were controlled. The overland routes were controlled. Africa stretched southward farther than anyone had mapped. The Atlantic Ocean seemed endless, possibly unending. Old maps labelled unknown waters with warnings about sea monsters and edges beyond which ships would fall into nothing. And yet, someone had to try, because the potential profit was simply too large to ignore. Let us be precise about the money involved. In 1497, a Portuguese merchant could buy pepper in India for about 3 ducats per hundredweight, a unit of weight equal to roughly 112 pounds. That same pepper sold in Lisbon for 40 to 50 ducats per hundredweight. In London or Antwerp, it might bring 60 or 70 ducats. Think about what this meant. A ship that could carry 200 tons of cargo could hold roughly 4,000 hundredweights. If half that cargo was pepper, bought at 3 ducats, and sold at 50 ducats, the gross revenue was 94,000 ducats. 94,000 ducats from a single voyage. A skilled craftsman in Lisbon earned perhaps 40 to 50 ducats per year. A comfortable merchant family might have an annual income of 200 to 300 ducats. 94,000 ducats was wealth beyond the comprehension of ordinary people. Of course, that was gross revenue, not profit. The costs had to be subtracted, and the costs were extraordinary. But before we count the costs, we need to understand where the money came from in the first place. Because mounting a voyage to India required capital that almost no one possessed. The ships themselves were expensive. A caravel, the smaller, more manoeuvrable vessel favoured for exploration, cost between 600 and 1,000 ducats to build. A larger carrack might cost 2,000 to 3,000 ducats. These were not simple fishing boats. They were complex pieces of technology, requiring skilled shipwrights, expensive timber, iron fittings, canvas sails, and miles of rope. Provisioning the ships cost almost as much as building them. A crew of 40 men sailing for 6 months needed enormous quantities of food and water, salted meat, dried fish, hardtack biscuits baked until they were nearly indestructible, wine, because water went bad in barrels after a few weeks, olive oil, cheese, dried beans. The provisions for one voyage might cost 300 to 500 ducats. Then there were the trade goods. You could not arrive in India empty-handed. Asian merchants wanted European products to trade for their spices. Silver and gold were always welcome, woolen cloth from Flanders, glassware from Venice, copper and tin, weapons. Each ship needed a cargo of trade goods worth hundreds or thousands of ducats. Add it together. One ship, properly equipped, with provisions and trade goods, cost between 2,000 and 5,000 ducats before it ever left harbour. An expedition of 3 or 4 ships, the minimum for safety and redundancy, meant 10,000 to 20,000 ducats. Where did this money come from? For the earliest Portuguese voyagers, the answer was the king. Portuguese kings in the 1400s were not wealthy by the standards of French or Spanish monarchs. Portugal was a small kingdom with limited resources, but the Portuguese crown had one advantage: a genuine obsession with reaching Asia by sea. This obsession had a name attached to it: Prince Henry the Navigator. He was not really a navigator himself. He rarely went to sea. But he sponsored expedition after expedition down the African coast, funding them from his own revenues and from the treasury of the Military Order of Christ, which he controlled. Henry died in 1460, but the project continued. Portuguese kings kept sending ships south, each one going a little farther than the last. mapping the coast, establishing trading posts, learning the winds and currents, building knowledge slowly, voyage by voyage, year by year. This was investment on a royal scale. For decades there was no return. Ships sailed, mapped coastline, and came back with minimal profit. The Portuguese crown was funding a multi-generational research and development project with no guarantee it would ever pay off. But by the 1480s, the investment was beginning to bear fruit. Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, proving that ships could reach the Indian Ocean from the Atlantic. The route to Asia by sea was now possible, difficult and dangerous, but possible. 9 years later, Vasco da Gama would complete the first round-trip voyage from Portugal to India, and the economics of everything would change. But the Portuguese were not alone. Across the border, Spain watched, and Spain had a different approach to funding exploration. Where Portugal relied on royal funding and gradual expansion, Spain took bigger risks with private capital. Christopher Columbus did not initially approach Spain. He went to Portugal first, presenting his plan to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. The Portuguese examined his calculations, consulted their own experts, and rejected the proposal. They thought Columbus had miscalculated the size of the Earth. They were right. He had. But they were also unwilling to gamble on his unlikely scheme when they had their own Africa route already showing promise. Columbus then approached the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. After years of negotiation, they agreed to fund him. But the funding structure was revealing. The Spanish crown did not pay for everything. Private investors contributed to Columbus's first voyage. The Pinzon brothers, who captained 2 of his 3 ships, invested their own money. Genoese merchants living in Spain contributed funds. The total cost was approximately 2 million maravedis, a Spanish currency unit. To put that in context, 2 million maravedis was equivalent to about 5,000 ducats. A substantial sum, but not ruinous. Columbus's expedition was funded at about half the cost of a similar Portuguese voyage because his ships were smaller and the expected journey was supposedly shorter. Of course, Columbus did not reach Asia. He found Caribbean islands instead. But the economic calculation was similar. Invest in ships and sailors, take enormous risk, hope for enormous return. Spain's New World ventures would eventually prove far more profitable than anyone initially imagined. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The point is this. By 1500, 2 European kingdoms were pouring money into overseas exploration on an unprecedented scale. They were doing so because the potential returns justified extraordinary risk. But who actually calculated these risks? Who decided that a 50% chance of total loss was acceptable if the other 50% meant 20-fold profit? The answer lies in a new class of people emerging in late medieval Europe. Merchant bankers, families like the Medici in Florence and the Fuggers in Augsburg. These were not just merchants who bought and sold goods. They were financiers who lent money to kings, managed accounts across borders, and understood risk in ways that would be familiar to modern investors. The Medici had built their fortune on banking. They operated branches across Europe, transferring funds, exchanging currencies, and lending to rulers who needed cash immediately and would repay later, maybe. Lending to kings was risky. Kings could default, but kings also controlled tax revenue, mining rights, trade monopolies. A loan to a king might be repaid with interest, or it might be repaid with trading privileges worth far more than the original loan. The Fugger family operated similarly. Jakob Fugger, known as Jakob the Rich, lent enormous sums to the Habsburg emperors. In return, he gained control of silver and copper mining rights across Central Europe. The Fuggers financed royal spending and were repaid through commodity flows. These families understood something crucial: diversification. A merchant banker in 1500 did not invest all his capital in one venture. He spread it across many ventures. He lent to multiple kings. He invested in multiple trading expeditions. Some would fail, some would succeed. If the successful ventures more than compensated for the failures, the portfolio as a whole was profitable. This is the same logic that drove early exploration financing. No single voyage was certain to succeed. Many ships were lost to storms, disease, navigation errors, hostile encounters, or simple bad luck. But if one successful voyage could return 5 times or 10 times its cost, then losing half the ships you sent was financially acceptable, the mathematics of risk and return. Consider the numbers from actual Portuguese voyages in the late 1400s. Records are incomplete, but historians have reconstructed approximate figures. A well-equipped caravel cost perhaps 800 ducats to build and provision. If it returned with a full cargo of pepper, bought at source prices and sold at European prices, the revenue might be 15,000 to 20,000 ducats. Subtract the original 800 ducats in costs. Add costs of crew wages, wear on the ship, and other expenses. Perhaps another 500 to 1,000 ducats total. Net profit: 14,000 to 18,000 ducats on an investment of 800 ducats. That is a return of 1,700 to 2,200%. No other investment in late medieval Europe offered anything remotely comparable. Land might yield 3 to 5% per year in rent. A successful merchant venture trading within Europe might return 20 to 30%. Lending to kings might yield 10 to 15% interest, if they repaid at all. But a successful voyage to India could return 2,000%. Of course, many ships never returned. Storms sank ships. Reefs destroyed hulls. Crews died of scurvy when their bodies ran out of vitamin C after months without fresh food. Ships were attacked by pirates or hostile navies. Navigation errors sent expeditions hopelessly off course. Estimates of ship loss rates vary, but a reasonable figure for early exploration voyages is 20 to 30% never returned. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 ships was simply gone, lost with all hands, all cargo, all investment. This seems devastating. How could anyone accept a 1 in 4 chance of total loss? Because the returns on success were high enough to more than compensate. If you send 5 ships and lose 1, you have lost 1 investment but gained 4 successful returns. If each successful return is 1,700%, your portfolio return is still enormous despite the loss. This is why exploration happened. Not because anyone was brave, though many were. Not because anyone sought glory, though some did. But because the mathematics worked. Because people with capital calculated that the expected return, factoring in both the probability of success and the magnitude of profit when successful, justified the risk. Exploration was venture capital before the term existed, and the people providing the capital were not romantic adventurers. They were calculating investors who understood that high risk could be acceptable if the potential return was proportionally higher. Let us follow the money more precisely. The Portuguese crown around 1500 had annual revenue of roughly 400,000 to 500,000 ducats. This came from taxes, customs duties, royal monopolies, and rents from crown lands. Not an enormous sum compared to larger kingdoms like France or Spain, but enough to function. Funding exploration voyages meant diverting money from other uses. Every ducat spent on ships and sailors was a ducat not spent on building fortifications, paying soldiers, or reducing royal debt. The Portuguese kings made a calculated choice. They believed the future revenue from Asian trade would exceed the present cost of reaching it. They were gambling the treasury on geography. By 1500, after decades of investment, the gamble was starting to pay. Vasco da Gama's return from India in 1499 brought cargo worth 60 times the cost of his voyage. 60 times! That single expedition recouped a substantial portion of the previous decade's investment. Suddenly, the route to India was not theoretical. It was proven. It was profitable. And now the question was not whether to invest in Asian trade, but how much to invest and how quickly. The Portuguese crown moved to monopolize the route. Royal decrees declared that all trade with India was a crown monopoly. Private merchants could not sail there without royal permission. All cargoes had to pass through royal customs houses where the crown took its share. This made sense from the crown's perspective. The state had funded the research. The state had taken the risk. Now the state would reap the reward. But monopolies are difficult to enforce over oceans, and other kingdoms noticed Portugal's success. Spain, having stumbled onto the Americas, began exploring the Pacific, eventually finding its own route to Asian spices via the Philippines. The Dutch and English, watching Iberian profits, began planning their own expeditions. The age of monopoly would be brief. But for a few decades around 1500, Portugal controlled the maritime route to Asia, and the money flowed into Lisbon like nothing Europe had ever seen. Trade goods were one source of profit, but there were others. Every ship that sailed needed provisions. Portuguese merchants sold salted meat, hardtack and wine to the crown for outfitting voyages. They profited from the expeditions without ever leaving shore. Every returning ship needed to sell its cargo. Merchants bought Asian goods from the crown and distributed them across Europe. They acted as intermediaries, adding their own markup. Every captain and sailor who survived a voyage returned with money to spend. Taverns, tailors, and brothels near the docks prospered. Every new trading post in Africa or Asia needed supplies from Portugal. Construction materials, weapons, trade goods, a permanent flow of outbound cargo to sustain the overseas network. The exploration economy created a web of connected businesses, all profiting from the royal investment in ships and sailors. And at the centre sat the accountants. We do not often think of accountants as central figures in exploration, but they were. Every voyage required meticulous record-keeping. Cargo manifests list in every item loaded and unloaded. Account books tracking every ducat spent and earned. Customs records documenting every tax collected. The Portuguese crown employed an army of clerks to manage this information. They tracked which ships sailed when, which returned, which were lost. They calculated profit and loss. They adjusted prices based on supply and demand. They reported to the king how much the Asian trade was actually earning. These accountants worked in stone buildings in Lisbon, far from the ocean. They never saw India. They never faced a storm or tasted scurvy. But they were as essential to the enterprise as any sailor, because exploration only made sense if the numbers added up. If costs exceeded revenues, the whole project collapsed. The accountants made sure everyone knew whether the gamble was paying off, and for those first few decades, it was. The revenues far exceeded the costs. The return on investment justified everything. But as we will see, high profits attract competition, and competition erodes monopolies. And the economics that made exploration profitable in 1500 would look very different by 1600. That story comes later. For now, understand this. The age of exploration began not with curiosity or courage, but with calculation. People counted the cost, they weighed the risk, they calculated the return, and they decided that the potential profit justified the almost certain loss of ships and men. They were right. For a time. The money that built the ships came from kings and merchants who understood one thing clearly. Some risks are worth taking if the reward is large enough. And the reward waiting in Asian ports was larger than anyone in Europe had ever imagined. The ships sailed for cargo. But what exactly was that cargo worth? Let us be specific. Let us count what filled the holds and justified the risk. In 1500, a Portuguese caravel returning from India might carry 200 tons of goods. Not all of it would be spices. Some space went to porcelain, silk, and other valuables. But the bulk, perhaps 150 tons, would be pepper. 150 tons of pepper. To understand what this meant, we need to understand pepper itself. Pepper grew in India, particularly along the Malabar coast in the southwest. The pepper vine produced small berries that were harvested, dried in the sun, and sold by weight. Black pepper came from berries picked before full ripeness. White pepper came from fully ripe berries with the outer skin removed. In Calicut or Cochin, the major pepper ports of India, merchants sold pepper to Portuguese traders for approximately 3 ducats per hundredweight. A hundredweight was 112 pounds. Do the mathematics. 150 tons equals roughly 300,000 pounds. That equals about 2,700 hundredweights. At 3 ducats per hundredweight, the purchase price for 150 tons of pepper was approximately 8,000 ducats. 8,000 ducats bought in India. The same pepper sold in Lisbon brought 40 to 50 ducats per hundredweight. Sometimes more when supply was tight. Let us use 45 ducats as a middle estimate. 2,700 hundredweights at 45 ducats equals 121,500 ducats. Revenue of 121,000 ducats from a purchase of 8,000 ducats. The gross profit was 113,000 ducats on a single cargo from a single ship. Subtract the cost of the voyage itself, perhaps 2,000 ducats for the ship and provisions. Subtract crew wages, another 1,000 ducats for a crew of 40 men over 18 months. Subtract port fees, bribes, losses to spoilage, another 1,000 ducats. Net profit, approximately 109,000 ducats. A skilled worker in Lisbon earned 40 ducats per year. This single cargo represented the lifetime earnings of over 2,000 workers. No wonder people were willing to risk ships and lives. But pepper was only the beginning. Cloves were even more valuable. These were the dried flower buds of a tree that grew on just a handful of tiny islands in the Moluccas, part of what is now Indonesia. The entire world's supply of cloves came from perhaps 5 small islands. No other place on Earth grew them. This geographic monopoly made cloves extraordinarily expensive. In the Moluccas, cloves sold for roughly 8 to 10 ducats per hundredweight, more expensive than pepper at the source. But in Europe, Cloves brought 100 to 150 ducats per 100 weight. The markup was even more extreme than pepper. A ship carrying 10 tons of cloves, roughly 180 hundredweights, represented a purchase price of perhaps 1,500 ducats in the Moluccas. The same cargo sold in Lisbon for 18,000 to 27,000 ducats. One cargo, 10 tons, profit of 15,000 to 25,000 ducats after costs. Why were cloves so valuable? They were used in cooking, certainly. A wealthy household might use cloves in wine, in baked goods, in meat dishes. But the quantities needed for cooking were small. A few ounces went a long way. The real value lay in scarcity and status. Serving food flavoured with cloves announced to everyone at your table that you had access to something rare. Something that came from the opposite side of the world, something most people would never taste. And like pepper, cloves were believed to have medicinal properties. Physicians prescribed cloves for digestion, for toothache, for bad breath. Apothecaries stocked them alongside other precious substances. The medical claims were often nonsense, but belief created demand. And demand at European prices far exceeded supply from 5 small islands. Nutmeg occupied a similar position. It came from trees grown only on the Banda Islands, another tiny archipelago in the Moluccas. Like cloves, nutmeg had effectively zero competition. No other region produced it. Nutmeg sold in the Banda Islands for roughly 10 ducats per 100 weight. In Europe, the same nutmeg brought 120 to 200 ducats per 100 weight. The profit margin was extraordinary, but the quantities traded were smaller than pepper or cloves because nutmeg was used sparingly. A merchant might carry 2 or 3 tons of nutmeg alongside larger cargoes of other spices. Still, those 2 tons represented perhaps 3,600 to 7,200 ducats in profit after purchase and transport costs. Cinnamon added another layer to the spice trade. True cinnamon came from the bark of trees grown in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The bark was harvested, dried, and rolled into the familiar quills that Europeans purchased. Like other spices, cinnamon commanded enormous markups between source and destination. In Ceylon, cinnamon cost approximately 4 ducats per 100 weight. In Lisbon, the same cinnamon sold for 60 to 80 ducats per 100 weight. A ship carrying 20 tons of cinnamon, about 360 hundredweights, represented a purchase of roughly 1,400 ducats and European sales of 21,000 to 28,000 ducats. Net profit after expenses, 18,000 to 25,000 ducats. Notice a pattern emerging. Every major spice came from a specific limited region. Pepper from Malabar, cloves from 5 islands in the Moluccas, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cinnamon from Ceylon. Each commodity had natural monopolies based on geography and climate, and each commanded prices in Europe that were 10 times, 20 times, sometimes 40 times the purchase price at the source. This was not ordinary trade. This was arbitrage at continental scale, buying in one market at one price and selling in another market at a vastly higher price, with the profit determined by the distance between them and the difficulty of connecting them. The Portuguese, by finding the sea route to India, had inserted themselves into this price gap. They bought at Asian prices and sold at European prices, capturing the margin that had previously been divided among a dozen intermediaries as the overland routes. But spices were not the only valuable cargo. Silk came from China, Persia, and India. The finest silk, smooth, lustrous fabric woven from threads produced by silkworms, was a luxury good throughout Europe. Italian cities had their own silk production, but Asian silk was considered superior and exotic. Silk was valuable by weight and by volume. It took up relatively little space in a ship's hold compared to its value. A single bale of high-quality Chinese silk might weigh 50 pounds and sell for 100 ducats in Europe. A ship could carry hundreds of bales. Porcelain arrived from China. These were ceramics far finer than anything European potters could produce at the time. Thin, translucent, perfectly glazed. Blue and white porcelain became especially prized. Wealthy Europeans displayed Chinese porcelain in their homes as symbols of sophistication and global reach. Porcelain was fragile. Much of it broke during the voyage, but what survived commanded high prices. A single large vase might sell for 20 to 50 ducats. Dinner services of matched plates and bowls could bring hundreds of ducats. The breakage rate was a cost of doing business. Merchants packed porcelain carefully in rice or straw, but storms and rough handling still destroyed perhaps 20 to 30% of each shipment. This loss was calculated into the pricing. The surviving pieces had to be valuable enough to cover the cost of the broken ones. Precious stones and pearls travelled in even smaller packages. A handful of rubies or sapphires from Burma or Ceylon could fit in a sailor's pocket and be worth a year's wages. Pearls from the Persian Gulf commanded premium prices in European jewellery markets. These goods were easy to smuggle and difficult to track. Ships' captains and ordinary sailors often carried small quantities of gems or pearls in their personal belongings, trading privately when they returned to Europe. The official cargoes documented in customs records represented only part of the total trade. And then there were dyes, indigo, derived from plants grown in India, produced a deep blue colour prized by cloth merchants and dyers throughout Europe. European dyes could not match the intensity and permanence of Asian indigo. It became a major trade commodity, shipped in compressed cakes that took up little space relative to value. Brazil wood, harvested initially from coastal Brazil after the Portuguese discovered it, produced red dye. The wood was cut, shipped to Europe, and processed by dyers who extracted the colour. Dyes were industrial commodities rather than luxuries. Cloth production depended on them. The market was large and steady, less spectacular than spices but equally profitable over time. Now consider the economics of a mixed cargo. A Portuguese carrack in 1520 might load the following in Cochin: 120 tons of pepper at 3 ducats per hundredweight, purchased for roughly 6,500 ducats. 8 tons of cloves at 10 ducats per hundredweight, purchased for 1,400 ducats. 5 tons of nutmeg at 10 ducats per hundredweight, purchased for 900 ducats. 10 tons of cinnamon at 4 ducats per hundredweight, purchased for 700 ducats. 20 bales of silk, purchased for 2,000 ducats. 500 pieces of porcelain, purchased for 1,000 ducats. 3 tons of indigo, purchased for 600 ducats. Miscellaneous items, pearls, gems, medicinal substances, another 1,000 ducats. Total purchase cost, approximately 12,000 ducats. This same cargo, sold in Lisbon, pepper at 45 ducats per hundredweight, 70,000 ducats. Cloves at 125 ducats per hundredweight, 18,000 ducats. Nutmeg at 150 ducats per hundredweight, 13,000 ducats. Cinnamon at 70 ducats per hundredweight, 12,500 ducats. Silk, 8,000 ducats. Porcelain after breakage, 3,000 ducats. Indigo, 3,000 ducats. Miscellaneous, 4,000 ducats. Total revenue, approximately 131,500 ducats. Gross profit, 119,500 ducats on an investment of 12,000 ducats. Subtract voyage costs. The ship itself might be worth 3,000 ducats, but it would make multiple voyages. Allocate 1,000 ducats depreciation per voyage. Provisions and trade goods for the outbound journey, 1,000 ducats. Crew wages, 1,500 ducats. Port fees, bribes, and miscellaneous expenses, 500 ducats. Total costs, 16,000 ducats. Net profit, 115,500 ducats. That is a return of 720% on the total investment in 18 to 24 months. No other economic activity in the world circa 1520 offered comparable returns. But this calculation assumes the ship returned, and many did not. Storms in the Indian Ocean sank ships with horrifying regularity. The monsoon winds that made sailing possible also created massive waves and driving rain. Ships caught in the wrong season faced near certain destruction. Reefs and rocks destroyed hulls. Navigational errors sent ships off course into shallow waters. The sound of grinding wood on coral was often the last sound a crew heard before the ocean poured in. Disease killed crews even when ships survived. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, appeared after 2 or 3 months at sea. Sailors' gums bled, their teeth loosened. Old wounds reopened. Without fresh food, half a crew might die before reaching port. Pirates and hostile navies attacked merchant ships. The waters around India swarmed with armed vessels from various kingdoms and trading groups. A Portuguese ship was a prize worth fighting for. Some crews fought back successfully, others were captured, cargo seized, survivors sold as slaves or killed. Fire on a wooden ship full of tarred rope and canvas meant disaster. A single spark in the wrong place could consume a vessel in hours. Sailors slept with the constant awareness that fire below decks meant death. The overall loss rate for Portuguese India voyages in the early 1500s was roughly 20 to 25%. 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 ships never returned. This seems catastrophic. But return to the mathematics. If you send 5 ships with combined investment of 80,000 ducats, and 1 ship is lost, you have lost 16,000 ducats. But 4 ships return, each with profit of 115,000 ducats. Total return, 460,000 ducats. Subtract the 80,000 ducats, original investment. Subtract the 16,000 ducats loss. Net profit across the fleet, 364,000 ducats. Return on investment, 455% even with a 20% loss rate. This is why the voyages continued despite the losses. This is why crews could be recruited despite the danger. This is why merchants and kings kept investing. The mathematics worked. The expected return, accounting for probability of loss, justified the risk. But the profit margins were not stable. They were entirely dependent on limited supply and high European prices, and both those conditions would eventually change. As more ships sailed, more spices reached Europe. When supply increased, prices fell. The early voyages in the 1490s and early 1500s faced very limited competition. Portuguese ships had nearly exclusive access to the sea route. They could charge whatever the market would bear. By 1520, more ships meant more cargo. By 1540, even more. The supply of pepper in Lisbon increased year after year, and as supply increased, The price per hundredweight gradually declined. Pepper that sold for 50 ducats per hundredweight in 1500 might bring only 40 ducats in 1520. By 1540, perhaps 35 ducats. By 1560, perhaps 30 ducats. The decline was gradual but relentless. More ships meant more supply, meant lower prices, meant lower profit margins. The Portuguese tried to control this by limiting the number of ships they sent. The Crown issued licenses for a specific number of vessels per year, attempting to maintain scarcity and prices. But enforcement was difficult. Ships sailed without licenses. Merchants smuggled cargo through alternative ports. And other European powers began reaching Asia. The Spanish found their own route across the Pacific. The Dutch and English would soon follow with their own expeditions. Competition was coming, and competition would transform the economics of everything. But in 1520 the system still worked. The cargo still justified the cost. The ships still sailed. The fortunes were still being made. Walk with me into the hold of a returning ship. Smell the pepper, sharp and biting, overwhelming in such quantities. Feel the rough texture of cinnamon bark bundled in bales. See the silk carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from water. Notice the porcelain packed in wooden crates cushioned with rice straw. This cargo represents years of labour. Indian farmers growing pepper vines. Workers harvesting cloves in the Moluccas. Craftsmen in China shaping porcelain. Silk weavers in Persia. Dye makers in Bengal. Their labour, concentrated into this hold, is about to be converted into European prices. The value will multiply as the cargo moves from Asian hands to Portuguese hands to European merchants to wealthy customers. At each step, someone takes a share. The Indian merchant who sold the pepper makes a profit. The Portuguese ship captain and crew receive wages. The Lisbon merchant who buys the cargo adds his markup. The retailer in Venice or London adds another. The final customer, a wealthy family seasoning their roast with pepper or displaying Chinese porcelain in their home, pays a price that includes all these accumulated margins. This is how wealth flowed, not created from nothing, but transferred through trade. Value existed in the price gap between markets. The merchants who connected those markets captured that value, and the greatest price gaps in the world circa 1500 were between Asia and Europe. That is what the cargo represented. That is what justified building the ships, recruiting the crews, risking the storms. The hold of one ship, properly filled, could make 10 men wealthy for life, could fund the next 5 voyages, could pay for fortresses and trading posts across Asia, could change the balance of power between kingdoms. The cargo was everything. Without it, the ships were just wood floating on water. With it, they were vessels of transformation, carrying value across oceans, turning Asian goods into European wealth. And for a few brief decades, the profit margins were so large that it seemed like the voyages could continue forever, generating wealth endlessly, making everyone involved rich beyond measure. They were wrong. But they could not see that yet. Tonight, the ship returns to harbour. The hold is full. The crew has survived. The cargo will be unloaded, counted, taxed, and sold. And the accountants will record one more successful voyage in their ledgers. One more proof that the economics of distance and difference could generate fortunes. The age of exploration ran on cargo, on pepper and cloves and silk and porcelain, on the simple fact that things valued cheaply in one place commanded high prices in another. and on the willingness of some people to risk everything to capture the difference. The ships carried cargo, but the cargo did not move itself. Every voyage required people, sailors to work the rigging, navigators to plot courses, carpenters to repair damage, cooks to prepare food, soldiers to fight when fighting became necessary, and the captain to command everything. These people had to be recruited, paid, and kept alive long enough to complete the voyage. The economics of human labour shaped every expedition as much as the economics of spices. Let us count what it cost to crew a ship. A typical Portuguese caravel sailing to India carried 40 to 60 men. Smaller crews were possible but dangerous. Storms and disease would reduce numbers, and too few survivors meant the ship could not be sailed home. Larger crews consumed provisions faster and required higher wages. 40 men was a reasonable minimum for a voyage expected to last 18 months. At the top of this hierarchy sat the captain. He commanded the ship, made navigation decisions, negotiated with Asian merchants, and represented Portuguese authority in foreign ports. A captain on an India voyage was not merely a sailor. He was a diplomat, a trader, and a military commander. Captains earned between 200 and 400 ducats for a complete voyage. Some received additional payment in the form of cargo space, the right to carry a certain amount of goods for private trade, the profits from which belonged to the captain personally rather than the crown. This cargo space was valuable. A captain with the right to carry 5 tons of pepper for his own account could earn another 1,000 ducats or more beyond his base salary. The total compensation for a successful captain might reach 1,500 ducats for a single voyage. 1,500 ducats was substantial wealth. It represented 30 years of wages for an ordinary labourer. But the captain bore enormous responsibility and substantial risk. If the voyage failed, if the ship was lost, if cargo was damaged through poor decisions, the captain's reputation suffered. Future employment became difficult. Below the captain came the pilot. This was the navigation specialist, the man who understood currents and winds and stars. Pilots kept the ship on course, calculated position, and advised the captain on routing. A skilled pilot was worth whatever he charged because navigation errors meant death. Pilots earned 100 to 200 ducats per voyage, sometimes more if they had proven track records. Like captains, they often received cargo space for private trade. The master, sometimes called the sailing master, managed the actual operation of the ship. He supervised the crew, maintained discipline, oversaw repairs, and ensured that orders were executed. He earned 80 to 150 ducats per voyage. Then came the ordinary sailors. These men climbed the rigging, adjusted sails, worked the pumps, scrubbed decks, loaded and unloaded cargo. They were divided into able seamen and ordinary seamen based on experience. An able seaman earned approximately 40 to 60 ducats for the voyage. An ordinary seaman earned 30 to 40 ducats. 40 ducats for 18 months of work equals roughly 2 ducats per month. Compare this to a labourer on land who might earn 3 to 4 ducats per month. The sailor actually earned less than he could make on shore. Why would anyone accept this? Several reasons. First, the sailor received food and shelter during the voyage. He didn't have to pay rent or buy provisions. The wage was supplemental to basic survival, which the ship provided. Second, sailors often received a small allowance of cargo space for private trade. Even an ordinary seaman might be permitted to carry 50 pounds of pepper in his personal belongings. Bought in India at source prices and sold in Lisbon, £50 could yield 10 to 15 ducats profit, a meaningful addition to base wages. Third, for young men from poor families, sailing offered adventure and the possibility of advancement. An ordinary seaman who proved capable might become an able seaman, then eventually a boatswain or master, climbing toward the higher ranks where real money could be made. But the risks were extraordinary. Mortality rates on early India voyages range from 15 to 30%. 15 to 30%. That meant on a ship with 40 crew, 6 to 12 men would die before returning to Portugal. Most deaths came from disease. Scurvy appeared after 2 to 3 months without fresh food. Vitamin C deficiency caused bleeding gums, loosening teeth, weakness, and eventually death. Sailors did not understand the cause. They knew only that men got sick at sea and died. Dysentery struck when water supplies became contaminated. Sailors drank from barrels that had been filled weeks or months earlier. Bacteria multiplied. Men developed severe diarrhea, became dehydrated, and died. Tropical fevers, malaria, and other diseases infected crews when ships stopped at ports in Africa or India. Mosquitoes carried illness from shore to ship. Men sickened with high fevers and chills. Some recovered, many did not. Accidents killed men as well, falling from rigging, swept overboard in storms, crushed by shifting cargo, injured in fights with pirates or hostile ships. The ocean and the work were both unforgiving. The wages for ordinary sailors look different when viewed against mortality risk. A 40 ducat wage for an 18-month voyage with a 25% chance of death means the expected value, if you survived, was actually higher in compensation per risk than it initially appeared, and those who died left no families to support. The Crown or the merchant sponsors were not obligated to pay survivors or dependents. The wage agreement ended with the sailor's life. This might seem cruel, but it was standard practice. Sailors understood the terms, they accepted them or chose other work. Now, consider the specialists aboard ship. Every vessel carried a carpenter. Ships leaked. Storms damaged hulls. Masts cracked. Rigging needed repairs. The carpenter kept the ship functional, often working throughout the voyage on continuous maintenance. He earned 60 to 80 ducats, more than ordinary sailors because his skills were essential and not easily replaced. A cooper maintained the barrels that held food, water, and cargo. Barrels were critical technology. They had to remain watertight despite heat, humidity, and rough handling. A skilled cooper could take apart damaged barrels, reuse the staves, and assemble new containers from available materials. He earned 50 to 70 ducats. A surgeon or barber surgeon treated injuries and illnesses. His effectiveness was limited by the medical knowledge of the era, which meant he could set broken bones and sew wounds but could do little for scurvy or fever. Still, his presence was psychologically important to the crew. He earned 60 to 100 ducats. A chaplain or priest accompanied many voyages, especially those sponsored by the Portuguese crown. His role was to conduct religious services, hear confessions, and provide spiritual comfort. He earned 50 to 80 ducats, and usually received better food and accommodations than ordinary sailors. Soldiers travelled on most trading vessels. These were not sailors but fighting men, recruited to defend the ship against pirates and to provide force when Portuguese traders needed to intimidate Asian merchants or local rulers into cooperation. A typical crew might include 10 to 20 soldiers, Soldiers earned wages similar to sailors, 30 to 50 ducats for the voyage, but they also expected opportunities to plunder. When Portuguese ships attacked enemy vessels or raided coastal settlements, soldiers received shares of captured goods. This informal compensation could exceed their base wages. Add everything together, a crew of 40 men might cost one captain 300 ducats, one pilot 150 ducats, one master 100 ducats, one carpenter 70 ducats, one cooper 60 ducats, one surgeon 80 ducats, one priest 60 ducats, 20 sailors 40 ducats each, totaling 800 ducats, 15 soldiers 40 ducats each, totaling 600 ducats. Total wages, approximately 2,220 ducats. This was the human cost of one voyage, and it assumed everyone survived. In practice, many died, and their unpaid wages remained with the crown or the merchant sponsors. But wages were not the only human cost. Consider the provisions required to keep 40 men alive for 18 months. Each man needed approximately 1.5 pounds of hardtack biscuit per day. Hardtack was flour, water, and salt baked into dense biscuits that could last for months without spoiling, though they often became infested with weevils, which sailors ate along with the biscuit. 1.5 pounds per day per man, times 40 men, times 550 days equals 33,000 pounds of hardtack. That is 16.5 tons, just biscuits. Each man needed roughly 1 gallon of liquid per day. Water went bad in barrels after a few weeks, so ships carried mostly wine. Wine kept better and had enough alcohol to kill some bacteria. 1 gallon per day times 40 men times 550 days equals 22,000 gallons. Stored in barrels, this represented enormous weight and space. Salted meat and fish provided protein. Each man received roughly ½ pound per day. 20 pounds per day for the crew times 550 days equals 11,000 pounds, or 5.5 tons. Dried beans, peas and lentils added variety and nutrition. Olive oil for cooking, vinegar for preservation and flavour, cheese that could last weeks. Onions and garlic that helped prevent scurvy, though no one understood why. The total provisions for 40 men for 18 months might weigh 40 to 50 tons and cost 500 to 800 ducats. These provisions took up space in the hold that could otherwise carry profitable cargo. Every ton of food was a ton that could not be pepper or cloves. The trade-off was unavoidable but costly, and the provisions were never quite enough. Storms delayed voyages. Ships had to shelter in ports waiting for favourable winds. 18 months could become 24 months. Food ran short. Rations were reduced, men weakened. Hungry, weakened men became sick more easily. Sick men could not work effectively. The ship became undermanned even without losing anyone overboard or to combat. The economics of human labour on these voyages created a grim calculation. How much do you invest in keeping the crew healthy versus maximising cargo space? How many men do you hire knowing some will die? How much do you pay knowing that dead men's wages need not be paid at all? The Portuguese crown and merchant sponsors made these calculations without sentiment. Men were costs to be minimised while ensuring enough survived to sail the ship home. This might seem monstrous, but from their perspective, it was simply rational. Every ducat spent on crew was a ducat not available for purchasing spices. Every ton of provisions was a ton of lost cargo capacity. The optimal balance was the one that minimised cost while maximising the probability of return. And there was always another poor young man willing to sign aboard, willing to risk his life for 40 ducats and the dream of profit from a few pounds of contraband pepper. Now cross the Atlantic. The economics of human labour took a different and darker form. By 1520, Portuguese and Spanish ships were not only sailing to Asia, they were also crossing the Atlantic to the Americas. And in the Americas they discovered a labour problem. The native populations declined catastrophically after European contact. Diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, swept through communities with no immunity. Populations fell by 80 to 90% within a generation. The survivors were too few to provide the labour European colonists demanded. European colonists wanted to farm, sugar in Brazil and the Caribbean, tobacco in North America, later cotton. These crops required intensive labour, planting, weeding, harvesting, processing. A profitable plantation needed dozens or hundreds of workers. European labourers could be recruited, but wages in Europe were too high. No one would cross the Atlantic to work for the pittance plantation owners wanted to pay, and European workers could leave, could resist, could demand better conditions. The colonists needed a different source of labour, captive labour, forced labour, people who could not refuse and could not leave. They turned to Africa. The Atlantic slave trade existed before 1500, but it expanded dramatically in the 1500s and 1600s as plantation agriculture grew. Portuguese traders established relationships with African kingdoms that captured prisoners in war and sold them to Europeans. The economics were straightforward and brutal. In West Africa, an enslaved person could be purchased for approximately 15 to 30 florins, roughly 10 to 20 ducats, depending on the exchange rate and year. The price varied by age, health, and gender. Young, healthy men commanded the highest prices. Women were valued for both labour and reproduction. Children were cheaper, but would eventually become adult workers. The same person, sold in Brazil or the Caribbean, brought 100 to 200 florins, roughly 70 to 140 ducats. This was a markup of approximately 500 to 700%. The profit margin was comparable to the spice trade, but the commodity was human beings. The costs of transport were significant. Ships designed for the slave trade, called slavers, could carry several hundred captives. They were packed into holds with minimal space, often unable to stand or move freely. The voyage from West Africa to Brazil took roughly 40 to 60 days. To the Caribbean, 60 to 90 days. Mortality during the Middle Passage, the Atlantic crossing, averaged 15 to 20% in the 1500s and 1600s, sometimes higher. Disease spread rapidly in the confined, unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses killed dozens. Some captives chose death over slavery, refusing food or jumping overboard when brought on deck. Ship captains calculated these losses into their pricing. If you purchased 400 people for an average of 20 ducats each, 8,000 ducats total investment, and 20% died during crossing, you landed 320 survivors. Sold at 100 ducats each, they brought 32,000 ducats revenue. Subtract the 8,000 ducats purchase price. Subtract 2,000 ducats for ship operation, crew wages and provisions. Net profit 22,000 ducats. Return on investment 220%. The mortality was not waste. It was factored into the business model. Dead captives reduced profit but did not eliminate it. The survivors were valuable enough to cover the cost of those who died. Between 1500 and 1800, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Roughly 2 million died during the crossing. 10.5 million arrived in the Americas. These numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. 12.5 million individual people, each one a person with a name, a family, a life before being captured, each one reduced to an accounting entry in a ship's ledger. The economics of slavery were different from the economics of hired sailors. Sailors received wages and could theoretically leave. Enslaved people received nothing and could never leave. Sailors worked for a voyage and then returned home. Enslaved people worked for their entire lives, and their children inherited their status. This created different economic calculations. The initial purchase price of an enslaved person was higher than the wages for hiring a labourer for a single year. But the enslaved person would work for 30 or 40 years, and their children would work as well. The long-term return on investment was far higher than wages could ever be. Plantation owners calculated return on enslaved labour with the same cold precision they used for calculating return on land or equipment. An enslaved person cost 100 ducats to purchase. Over 30 years of labour, they might produce value worth 3,000 ducats. Subtract food, housing, and supervision costs. Perhaps 50 ducats per year. 1,500 ducats total over 30 years. Net lifetime value, 1,500 ducats on an investment of 100 ducats. That is a 1,500% return over 3 decades. No hired labour could be acquired on those terms. Free workers demanded wages, left when they chose, could not be forced to work. Enslaved workers cost only the initial purchase and minimal maintenance, could be compelled to work, and had no choice but to remain. From a purely economic perspective, ignoring all moral considerations, slavery was the most profitable labour system ever devised for agricultural production. That is why it spread. That is why it persisted for centuries. Not because anyone believed it was good or right, but because it generated wealth for those who controlled it. The human cost was incalculable. Families separated, cultures destroyed, people worked to death, lives reduced to production units in someone else's ledger. But the economic system did not count those costs. It counted only profits and losses measured in ducats and florins and pounds sterling. The ships that carried enslaved people across the Atlantic were investments like any other. The captains and crews received wages like any other voyage. The merchants who financed the voyages calculated returns like any other trade. The plantation owners who purchased the labour treated it as capital investment like land or buildings. The system ran on the same logic as the spice trade. Buy cheap in one market, sell expensive in another, capture the difference as profit. The only difference was that the commodity was human beings, and the profits from that commodity-funded colonies built cities, enriched merchants, and shaped the development of 3 continents. By 1600, the Atlantic economy ran on 3 flows: manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to America, raw materials from America to Europe. The triangle trade. Ships sailed laden in all 3 directions, profitable at every leg. European ships carried textiles, weapons, alcohol, and manufactured goods to Africa. African merchants traded these goods for captives. Ships carried captives to America. American plantation owners purchased captives with proceeds from sugar, tobacco, and eventually cotton. Ships carried these agricultural goods to Europe, where they were processed and consumed. European factories turned raw materials into manufactured goods, which were shipped back to Africa. The circle was complete, and at every point someone profited. The sailors who worked these ships often saw nothing wrong with the system. They were being paid to sail and to move cargo. That the cargo consisted of human beings did not trouble most of them. It was work, like any other work. Some sailors became numb to it. They stopped seeing the people in the hold as people. They saw units of cargo that had to be kept minimally alive to preserve value. This psychological distance made the work bearable. Others felt guilt or horror, but continued anyway because they needed the wages. A sailor who refused to work on slave ships might find it difficult to get hired elsewhere. The trade was too profitable, too central to Atlantic commerce, to be avoided. And some participated actively in the violence, forcing captives into holds, punishing resistance, suppressing revolts. These men became instruments of the system, receiving wages for enforcing captivity. The economics of human labour in the age of exploration took two forms: free labour paid in wages for sailors and craftsmen. Forced labour paid nothing to the workers and everything to the owners. Both systems ran on calculation. Both counted costs and returns. Both treated people as economic inputs to be managed for maximum profit. The difference was that one system allowed people to leave, the other did not, and that difference created wealth on a scale that transformed the world. The ships sailed, the crews worked, the captives suffered, the merchants counted their profits, the plantations grew, the sugar and tobacco flowed to Europe. The money accumulated in the hands of those who controlled the trade, and no one who profited asked whether the system should exist. They asked only whether it was profitable. The answer was yes, enormously, catastrophically profitable. That is why it continued. That is why millions crossed the ocean in chains. That is why the labour economics of the age of exploration included not just sailors paid in ducats, but human beings bought and sold like pepper or cloves. The ships carried cargo. Some of that cargo walked and breathed and suffered and died. But in the ledgers it was all the same, all counted in ducats, all calculated for return on investment, all part of the great economic transformation that connected 3 continents and changed human civilization forever. The ships came and went, but some things stayed. If you were going to control trade across oceans, seasonal voyages were not enough. You needed permanent presence. You needed places where ships could shelter, repair, resupply, places where goods could be stored between seasons, places where your flag flew and your authority held. You needed forts, trading posts, settlements. Infrastructure, and infrastructure cost money, enormous, continuous, never-ending amounts of money. Let us count what it took to build an empire that would last. The Portuguese understood this necessity early. Their strategy along the African coast and into Asia was not conquest of territory. They lacked the population and military strength for that. Instead, they built fetorias, trading factories, fortified posts where Portuguese merchants could trade with local populations under protection of stone walls and cannon. A feitoria was part warehouse, part fortress, part embassy. It held goods awaiting shipment. It housed Portuguese officials and soldiers. It served as the physical manifestation of Portuguese presence in foreign lands. Building one was expensive. Consider the feitoria at Elmina, constructed on the coast of present-day Ghana in 1482. This was one of the first permanent Portuguese posts in Africa, designed to control gold trade from the interior. The initial construction required transporting materials by ship from Portugal, cut stone for the walls, iron for reinforcement, tools, weapons, cannon. Workers skilled in fortification construction travelled with the materials because local labour could not be trusted with defensive structures. The cost of building Elmina was approximately 60,000 gold cruzados, roughly equivalent to 45,000 ducats. This was an enormous sum. It represented the cargo value of several successful India voyages, all invested in a single permanent structure. But the investment made economic sense. Elmina controlled access to gold from the African interior. Merchants who wanted to trade for that gold had to work through the Portuguese post or risk Portuguese interference. The Feitoria created a bottleneck that could be taxed, controlled, and profited from indefinitely. The construction cost was only the beginning. Once built, the fort had to be maintained. Stone walls deteriorated under tropical sun and rain. Mortar crumbled. Wood rotted. Roofs leaked. Every year, materials and labour had to be invested in keeping the structure functional. Maintenance costs ran perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 ducats annually. Not as dramatic as the initial construction, but relentless and unavoidable. Then there were the people. A Feitoria needed a garrison, soldiers to defend it, workers to maintain it, officials to manage trade. Elmina typically housed 50 to 100 Portuguese personnel at any given time, plus additional local workers and slaves. The Portuguese garrison received wages. A common soldier stationed in Africa earned roughly 30 to 40 ducats per year, less than soldiers in Portugal, but service overseas was considered hardship duty. Officers earned more, perhaps 60 to 80 ducats. The commander of the fort might receive 150 ducats or more, plus privileges to trade privately. 100 men at an average of 40 ducats each cost 4,000 ducats annually in wages alone. Add food, clothing, weapons, ammunition and other supplies, perhaps another 2,000 ducats per year. Total annual operating cost for one Feitoria, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 ducats, every year, forever. As long as the Portuguese wanted to maintain their presence, this was the hidden cost of empire. The ships that sailed generated spectacular profits on individual voyages, but the infrastructure that made those voyages possible consumed steady flows of money that never stopped. The Portuguese built Feitorias all along the African coast, at Arguim for the slave trade, at São Jorge da Mina for gold, at Mozambique and Sofala for access to the Indian Ocean trade. Each one required similar investment. Each one needed permanent garrison and maintenance. By 1500, the Portuguese crown was spending tens of thousands of ducats annually just maintaining African trading posts. This was before considering the cost in Asia, which would prove far larger. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, he found a complex network of existing trade. Muslim merchants from Arabia, Persia, and East Africa had been trading with Indian ports for centuries. They had relationships, knowledge, and infrastructure that the Portuguese could not immediately match. The Portuguese solution was familiar: build fortified trading posts where Portuguese power could be concentrated and defended. The first major Portuguese fortress in Asia was built at Cochin in 1503, then Cananor, then the crown jewel, Goa, captured in 1510, and transformed into the headquarters of Portuguese Asia. Goa was not merely a trading post, it became a city. The Portuguese built churches, administrative buildings, warehouses, shipyards, and residential quarters for a permanent population. At its height in the mid-1500s, Goa housed perhaps 15,000 Portuguese residents, plus thousands more Indians, enslaved Africans, and mixed-race populations. The infrastructure investment in Goa was staggering. The fortifications alone cost hundreds of thousands of ducats over decades of construction. Churches and government buildings added more. The shipyards, essential for repairing vessels that had sailed 6 months from Lisbon, required constant investment in tools, materials, and skilled labour. Then came the annual operating costs. Goa needed a large garrison, eventually several thousand soldiers, to defend against Indian kingdoms that resented Portuguese presence. The soldiers needed wages, food, weapons, and barracks. The city needed a governor and full administrative apparatus, judges, customs officials, clerks, priests, engineers. Each position carried a salary. The total wage bill for Portuguese officials in Goa ran into tens of thousands of ducats annually. The Estado da India, the Portuguese state of India, the formal name for their Asian empire, had an annual budget by the mid-1500s of approximately 400,000 to 500,000 ducats. This covered all Portuguese territories and posts from Mozambique to Macau, but Goa consumed the largest share. 400,000 ducats per year just to maintain infrastructure and personnel. This had to be paid from somewhere. The Portuguese crown collected revenue from customs duties on trade passing through its ports, from taxes on merchants, from direct royal trade monopolies. In good years, revenue exceeded costs. The Asian trade remained profitable overall. But in lean years, when ships were lost, when competition drove down spice prices, when wars with local kingdoms required extra military spending, the infrastructure cost continued regardless. The forts could not be abandoned without losing everything invested in them. The garrisons could not be dismissed without inviting attack. The Portuguese were locked in. They had built an empire that required continuous funding. They could not stop without losing it all. Consider the fortification at Diu, built starting in 1535 after the Portuguese secured control of this strategic island off the coast of Gujarat in India. Diu controlled access to trade routes along the western coast of India. The fortress was a masterpiece of military engineering. Massive stone walls, angular bastions designed to withstand cannon fire, deep moats, multiple layers of defence. It took years to complete and cost approximately 200,000 ducats. 200,000 ducats to build one fortress. But Diu anchored Portuguese control of a vital trade route. Ships wanting to trade at Gujarat ports had to respect Portuguese authority, or face interception by warships based at Diu. The fort was an investment that generated returns through control rather than through direct trade. The garrison at Diu numbered several hundred soldiers. Annual cost for wages, provisions, ammunition and maintenance ran perhaps 15,000 ducats, year after year. The Portuguese built similar fortifications at Hormuz, controlling the Persian Gulf entrance, at Malacca, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, at Colombo in Ceylon, at Macau in China. Each fort represented six-figure construction costs. Each demanded ongoing five-figure annual expenses. Add them together, and the total infrastructure cost of the Portuguese Asian Empire was immense. Hundreds of thousands of ducats invested in stone and iron, tens of thousands of ducats flowing out annually in wages and supplies. This was the price of permanence, of staying, of controlling trade routes year-round rather than just during seasonal voyages. The Spanish faced similar economics in the Americas. Their approach was different. They focused on conquest and colonization rather than trading posts, but the cost structure was comparable. After conquering the Aztec and Inca empires, the Spanish needed to administer vast territories. They built cities, Mexico City on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, Lima in Peru, Cartagena in Colombia. These were not temporary camps. They were permanent settlements with stone buildings, churches, administrative centres, and defences. Mexico City in the mid-1500s had perhaps 15,000 Spanish residents and many more indigenous inhabitants. The city required government buildings, a cathedral, fortifications, roads, water systems. The initial infrastructure investment ran into the millions of ducats over decades. And then there were the costs of administration. A viceroy governed on behalf of the Spanish king. He needed a salary, perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 ducats annually, a substantial sum. Below him were governors, judges, military commanders, customs officials, priests, clerks. The administrative apparatus of Spanish America employed thousands of people, all receiving wages. The Spanish crown established the treasure fleet system to ship American silver and gold back to Spain. This required naval bases in the Caribbean and at Seville in Spain, shipyards to build and maintain the galleons, fortifications at ports like Havana and Cartagena to protect the treasure during loading and assembly. The fortifications at Cartagena, built and expanded over the 1500s and 1600s, cost millions of ducats. The city faced constant threat from pirates and rival European powers who wanted to capture the silver shipments. The Spanish invested heavily in walls, forts, and garrisons to prevent this. The annual cost of maintaining the treasure fleet system, building ships, paying crews, garrisoning ports, administering customs, ran into hundreds of thousands of ducats. This was insurance. The treasure had to reach Spain safely, or the entire American enterprise became pointless. The infrastructure costs were necessary to protect the revenue stream. But here is the cruel mathematics the Spanish discovered. The infrastructure costs grew steadily, but the silver revenue, while enormous, was not infinite. Mines produced less over time as the richest veins were exhausted. Operating costs increased as mining went deeper. Competition from other European powers in the Americas drained resources. By the late 1600s, the infrastructure costs of the Spanish-American Empire often exceeded the net revenue it generated. The empire became a cost centre rather than a profit centre, but it could not be abandoned without losing face, losing power, and losing the investment of generations. The same trap that caught the Portuguese in Asia caught the Spanish in America. Infrastructure created commitment. Commitment created ongoing costs. Costs sometimes exceeded benefits, but sunk costs, the investments already made, prevented withdrawal. Let us walk through a less obvious cost: corruption and leakage. Any system spanning thousands of miles with authority delegated to distant officials will experience corruption. Money disappears, goods are diverted. Officials take bribes, soldiers supplement wages by smuggling. This is not unique to the age of exploration. It is universal in large organizations operating across distance. But in the 1500s and 1600s, the opportunities and scale of corruption were remarkable. A Portuguese customs official in Goa controlled what cargo was taxed and at what rate. He could accept bribes from merchants wanting lower assessments. He could partner with merchants in schemes where cargo was deliberately undervalued, taxes paid on the false valuation, and the difference split. A Spanish royal official in Mexico administered crown property and monopolies. He could sell licenses to trade in restricted goods, pocketing the fees. He could divert crown resources to his own ventures. A garrison commander could inflate the number of soldiers on his roster, collecting wages for ghost soldiers who did not exist and keeping the extra money. He could sell military supplies intended for the garrison. The opportunities were endless, and enforcement was nearly impossible. A corrupt official in Goa faced minimal oversight. The governor might be complicit or simply unable to monitor everything. Audits required months of ship travel from Lisbon and rarely caught sophisticated schemes. Witnesses could be intimidated or bribed. Estimates of leakage in the Portuguese Estado de India range from 10 to 30% of total revenue. If annual revenue was 500,000 ducats and 20% disappeared to corruption, that was 100,000 ducats lost. 100,000 ducats that should have returned to the crown treasury but instead lined the pockets of officials, merchants and soldiers who operated between the rules. The Spanish experienced similar problems. Royal officials in the Americas were expected to enforce crown monopolies, collect taxes, and administer justice. Many instead enriched themselves. The Spanish crown issued repeated orders demanding honesty and threatening punishment. The orders were largely ignored because enforcement was impractical. Corruption was an informal tax on the system, an unavoidable cost of operating at distance with limited oversight, and it fed back into infrastructure costs. If 20% of revenue leaked away, the remaining 80% had to cover the full cost of forts, garrisons, and administration. This meant either accepting lower profits or increasing the official taxes and fees charged to merchants, which in turn encouraged more corruption as merchants sought ways to avoid the higher charges. A vicious circle. Now consider the military costs that went beyond simple garrison duty. The Portuguese did not just build forts and trade peacefully. They fought. They fought rival European powers. They fought Indian kingdoms. They fought Muslim trading networks. They fought pirates. The Asian trade was never purely commercial. It was backed by violence and the threat of violence. The Portuguese navy in Asia, a fleet of armed ships based in Goa and other ports, existed to patrol trade routes, intercept competitors, and enforce Portuguese monopolies. Maintaining this fleet cost tens of thousands of ducats annually. Ships required provisions, crews, repairs, ammunition. When the Portuguese fought the Zamarin of Calicut in the early 1500s, they spent heavily on soldiers, weapons, and supplies. When they besieged Diu in the 1530s, the military costs were enormous. When they fought the Ottoman Empire for control of the Red Sea routes in the 1530s and 1540s, the expenses drained the treasury. Each war was justified as necessary to protect Portuguese trade. And perhaps it was, but each war cost money. Money that might otherwise have been profit became military expense. The Spanish faced similar military costs in the Americas, suppressing indigenous resistance, defending against rival European powers attempting to establish their own colonies, maintaining control over vast territories with small Spanish populations. The military costs were unpredictable. Some years were quiet. Other years saw major conflicts requiring emergency spending. But the baseline military infrastructure, soldiers, weapons, fortifications, had to be maintained continuously, regardless of whether active fighting was occurring. By the late 1500s, both the Portuguese and Spanish empires were spending more on military defense than they ever had before. Rival European powers, especially the Dutch and English, were challenging Iberian dominance. The competition required constant vigilance and increasing military investment. The infrastructure of empire was becoming a burden as much as an asset. Let us total the costs for the Portuguese Estado da India in, say, 1570. This is approximate, but historians have reconstructed rough figures. Fortifications and buildings, annual maintenance and new construction, perhaps 50,000 ducats. Garrisons and military personnel, wages for several thousand soldiers, perhaps 120,000 ducats. Civil administration, governors, judges, clerks, customs officials, perhaps 40,000 ducats. Naval fleet, ships, crews, supplies, perhaps 60,000 ducats. Miscellaneous, religious establishments, gifts to local rulers, emergency expenses, perhaps 30,000 ducats. Total annual cost, approximately 300,000 ducats. Revenue from trade, customs duties, and royal monopolies, approximately 400,000 to 500,000 ducats in good years. Net profit to the crown, 100,000 to 200,000 ducats. This seems like substantial profit, and it was. But compare it to the peak years of the early 1500s, when a single voyage could return 100,000 ducats profit with minimal infrastructure costs. The infrastructure had consumed the profit margins. The empire generated revenue, but the costs of maintaining the empire took most of it. And in bad years, when ships were lost, when competition drove down prices, when wars required extra spending, the cost could exceed revenue. The Asian empire could run at a loss. The Portuguese crown borrowed to cover shortfalls. They issued bonds, borrowed from merchant bankers, pledged future revenues. The debt accumulated. The infrastructure they had built to secure their trading empire became a financial trap. They could not abandon it without losing everything, but maintaining it consumed resources that might have been deployed more profitably elsewhere. This was the hidden economics of empire. The ships and the cargo were visible, the forts and garrisons were visible. But the slow drain of permanent costs, the accumulation of debt, the narrowing of profit margins, these were less visible but ultimately more consequential. The age of exploration was not just about sailing ships and discovering routes. It was about building permanent infrastructure to control those routes. An infrastructure once built could never be allowed to crumble without admitting defeat. The Portuguese and Spanish built empires that required continuous feeding, continuous investment, continuous military presence, continuous administration. They built structures that would last centuries in some cases, forts that still stand today as monuments or museums, cities that grew into major metropolitan areas, trading networks that reshaped global commerce. But they also built obligations that consumed wealth as fast as the trade generated it. They created systems that were profitable in aggregate, but that required enormous ongoing expenditure to maintain. The cargo in the ships justified the infrastructure. The infrastructure enabled the cargo, but the balance was always precarious. Always dependent on sufficient ships returning with sufficient valuable goods to cover the costs of the forts and the soldiers and the officials and the maintenance and the corruption and the wars. For a few decades, the balance held. The profit margins were large enough. The flow of spices and silver and gold covered the expenses and left surplus. But as we will see, that balance could not hold forever. The costs only grew. The revenues would eventually stagnate or decline, and the infrastructure built to capture wealth would become a millstone around the necks of the empires that built it. For now, though, the forts stood. The garrisons manned the walls, the officials collected their customs duties, the ships came and went, the system functioned, and in Lisbon and Seville, accountants recorded the revenues and the costs. They calculated the balance. They reported to kings who spent the surplus on wars in Europe, on palaces, on the endless expenses of royal courts. The infrastructure of empire made it all possible, and demanded everything in return. The infrastructure was expensive, the voyages were risky, and increasingly both required more capital than any single merchant or even a king could easily provide. A new structure emerged, a way of pooling money, spreading risk, and sharing profit that would reshape not just exploration, but the entire concept of how business could be organized. The joint stock company. Before we can understand what this meant, we need to understand what came before it. Early Portuguese and Spanish voyages were funded by the crown or by individual wealthy merchants. A single investor, perhaps the king, perhaps a rich merchant family, provided the capital for a voyage. If the voyage succeeded, that investor received all the profit. If the voyage failed, that investor bore all the loss. This meant exploration was limited to those who could afford to lose everything. A merchant with 10,000 ducats might invest in one voyage. If successful, he could fund another. But if the first voyage failed, he was ruined. He had no capital left for a second attempt. The risk was too concentrated. One failure meant total loss. Some merchants tried partnerships. 2 or 3 investors would pool funds for a single voyage, agreeing to share profits and losses. This helped. If the voyage failed, each investor lost only their portion, not everything they owned. They could survive to invest again. But partnerships had limitations. They were temporary. They existed for one voyage or one trading season. When the voyage ended, the partnership dissolved. Profits were distributed. The structure disappeared. If the same investors wanted to fund another voyage, they had to negotiate a new partnership from scratch. And partnerships were private. Only the partners knew the terms. Only the partners could invest. There was no way for someone outside the partnership to participate. This limited the total capital available. You could only pool as much money as your partners possessed. If you wanted to fund a larger enterprise, not one voyage but a fleet of ships, not 1 year but decades of continuous operations, partnerships were inadequate. The Dutch found a better way. In 1602, Dutch merchants created the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known to history by its initials VOC. The VOC was something new in the world. It was a corporation, a permanent entity that existed independently of its owners. It could own property, sign contracts, hire employees, and sue in court as if it were a person. But it was not a person. It was a structure, and it was funded through shares. Here is how it worked. The VOC issued shares, units of ownership in the company. Anyone with enough money could buy shares. Each share represented a small fraction of the total company. If you owned 1 share out of 10,000 total shares, you owned 1/10,000th of the entire VOC. The initial capital raised was 6.5 million guilders, approximately 3 million ducats. This was an enormous sum. No individual could provide it. No partnership could match it. But by dividing ownership into thousands of small shares, the VOC could tap wealth from hundreds of different investors. In 1602, over 1,800 people bought shares in the VOC. Some were wealthy merchants who invested thousands of guilders. Some were modest craftsmen or shopkeepers who invested a few hundred guilders. Some were widows investing inheritances. Some were institutions, churches and charities investing endowment funds. The minimum investment was 3,000 guilders, roughly 1,300 ducats. This was substantial but not impossible for a prosperous middle-class family. A successful merchant might invest 10,000 or 20,000 guilders. What did shareholders receive in return? Two things. First, they received dividends. The VOC promised to distribute a portion of its profits to shareholders regularly. The amount varied depending on how profitable the company was. In good years, dividends might be 20% of the share value. In lean years, 5 or 10%. Second, they received something unprecedented. They could sell their shares. Previous investment structures required commitment until the venture ended. If you invested in a partnership for a 3-year trading voyage, your money was locked in for 3 years. You could not get it back until the voyage completed and the partnership dissolved. VOC shares were different. If you needed money before the company distributed profits, you could sell your shares to someone else. The shares were transferable. A market developed where shares were bought and sold like any other commodity. This was the beginning of the stock market. In Amsterdam, brokers began trading VOC shares. Prices fluctuated based on news about the company's voyages and prospects. If a fleet returned with valuable cargo, share prices rose. If ships were reported lost, prices fell. An investor who bought shares at 100 guilders each might sell them a year later, for 120 guilders if the company was doing well. He would profit from the price increase plus whatever dividends he received. Or he might sell at 80 guilders if the company was struggling, taking a loss but recovering most of his capital. This liquidity, the ability to convert shares to cash, made the investment less risky. You were not locked in forever. You could exit if you needed to, or if you lost confidence in the company's management. The VOC used its massive capital to do what no individual merchant could do. It built a fleet of ships, not 1 or 2, but dozens. It established permanent trading posts across Asia. It hired thousands of employees. It negotiated treaties with Asian kingdoms. It functioned as a government as much as a business, with its own army and navy. The Dutch government granted the VOC a monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia. No other Dutch merchant could trade in Asian goods without VOC permission. This meant the company could control supply and maintain prices without competition from other Dutch traders. Of course, the VOC still faced competition from Portuguese, Spanish, and eventually English traders. But at least within the Netherlands it was unchallenged. The monopoly charter lasted 21 years initially. This gave the company time to establish itself, to build infrastructure, to create sustainable operations. The charter could be renewed, and was repeatedly for nearly 2 centuries. Now consider the returns. The VOC paid dividends almost every year from 1602 onward. The average dividend in the 1600s was roughly 18 to 20% annually. Think about what this meant. If you invested 1,000 guilders in VOC shares in 1602, you received approximately 180 to 200 guilders per year in dividends. In 5 years, you had recovered your entire investment through dividends alone. You still owned the shares, which you could sell. Everything after year 5 was pure profit. Compare this to other investments available in 1600. Land might yield 3 to 5% per year in rent. Lending money might earn 6 to 10% interest if the borrower repaid. Government bonds might yield 4 to 6%. The VOC offered returns 3 to 5 times higher than any alternative. Of course, it was riskier. The company could fail, ships could be lost, wars could disrupt trade. But the risk was spread across many voyages and many years. The company did not depend on any single ship or any single cargo. It operated continuously, with dozens of ships at sea at any time. This diversification made the risk more manageable than individual voyage investments. A merchant who invested his own money in a single ship faced total loss if that ship sank. A VOC shareholder faced only a small reduction in dividend if one ship among many was lost. The company could absorb losses that would ruin an individual merchant, and the share price appreciated over time. Shares that sold for 100 guilders in 1602 might sell for 200 or 300 guilders by 1630, as the company became established and profitable. An investor who sold after 25 years might triple or quadruple his money from price appreciation alone, in addition to all the dividends received along the way. The VOC became one of the most successful enterprises in history. Between 1600 and 1799, when it finally dissolved, it sent nearly 5,000 ships to Asia. It distributed dividends totaling approximately 500 million guilders. Share prices peaked at around 1,200% of original value. An investment of 1,000 guilders in 1602 could have grown to 12,000 guilders by the peak, plus 200 years of dividends. The total return was extraordinary. The success of the VOC inspired imitators. The English created their own East India Company, usually abbreviated EIC, in 1600. The structure was similar: joint stock ownership, monopoly charter from the English crown, focus on Asian trade. The English company raised less initial capital than the VOC, approximately £72,000 sterling, perhaps 120,000 ducats. The English economy was smaller than the Dutch economy. The pool of investors was smaller, but the same principles applied. English merchants and wealthy individuals bought shares. The company used the capital to outfit ships and establish trading posts. Profits were distributed as dividends. Shares could be traded. The English East India Company had a slower start than the VOC. Competition from the better established Portuguese and Dutch made profitable operations difficult initially, but the company persisted, and by the mid-1600s it was generating steady returns. The EIC dividend payments in the mid-1600s averaged roughly 10 to 15% annually, lower than the VOC but still attractive compared to other investments. Share prices fluctuated wildly based on political events, wars, and the success or failure of individual voyages. Both the VOC and EIC evolved beyond simple trading companies. They became quasi-governments. The VOC established the settlement of Batavia on Java in 1619, creating a permanent Dutch colonial presence in what is now Indonesia. Batavia became the Asian headquarters of Dutch operations, comparable to Portuguese Goa. The company governed Batavia and other territories it controlled. It collected taxes, enforced laws, maintained military forces, and negotiated treaties. The Viok flag represented Dutch power across Asia. This was unusual. Corporations in later centuries would be business entities regulated by governments. But the VOC was simultaneously a business and a government. It had sovereign powers delegated by the Dutch state but operated for private profit. Shareholders owned a profit-seeking government. This created strange incentives. The company made decisions based on profit rather than governance. It could be ruthless in ways that shocked even the colonial standards of the time. The VOC destroyed competitors, manipulated local politics, enforced monopolies through violence, and extracted maximum value from territories it controlled. This was not incidental cruelty. It was business strategy aimed at maximizing shareholder returns. The English East India Company followed a similar path. Initially focused on trade, it gradually acquired territory in India. By the 1700s, the EIC controlled vast regions of the Indian subcontinent, governing tens of millions of people. The company collected tax revenue from Indian territories. This revenue was supposed to fund administration and defense, with surplus returned to shareholders. In practice, the line between government revenue and company profit became blurred. Company officials enriched themselves from their positions of power. The structure of joint stock companies created principal-agent problems that modern economists would recognize immediately. The shareholders, the principals, wanted maximum profit and return on investment. The company's directors and overseas officials, the agents, managed operations on behalf of shareholders but had their own interests. Directors might pursue expansion and prestige rather than pure profit. Officials might embezzle company funds or engage in private trade using company resources. Monitoring was difficult across thousands of miles and months of ship travel. The VOC tried to address this through regular audits, strict accounting requirements, and severe penalties for fraud. Officials were required to submit detailed records. Their personal belongings were searched when they returned to the Netherlands to catch smuggling, but enforcement was imperfect. Many officials returned wealthy from private trading that technically violated company rules. The company tolerated this to some degree because completely preventing it was impossible, and because some corruption was preferable to losing experienced personnel. The English East India Company faced the same problems, often with less effective oversight. The corruption and private enrichment of EIC officials became legendary. Men left England with modest fortunes and returned decades later vastly wealthy from opportunities their positions provided. The shareholders back in London or Amsterdam received dividends, but they suspected, correctly, that much potential profit was being diverted by the agents they had hired to manage operations. This was the cost of the corporate structure. The separation of ownership and management created efficiency in some ways, but also created opportunities for those with direct control to benefit at the expense of distant shareholders. Despite these problems, the joint stock model succeeded because it solved the capital problem. It allowed accumulation of funds far beyond what individuals or partnerships could raise. It spread risk across many investors. It provided liquidity through tradable shares. It created permanent entities that could plan and invest for the long term. By the mid-1600s, the joint stock structure was spreading beyond Asian trade. Companies formed to colonize North America, to drain marshlands in England, to mine copper in Sweden, to establish fishing operations in the North Atlantic. Not all succeeded. Many joint stock ventures failed, Wiping out shareholder investments, the model did not guarantee success. It only made large-scale ventures possible, but the successes were spectacular enough to keep attracting capital. The VOC and EIC demonstrated that the model could work, that shareholders could profit, that companies could last decades or centuries, that the corporate form could accomplish things individuals could not. Consider the mathematics from a shareholder perspective. In 1620, a Dutch merchant might have 100,000 guilders to invest. He could keep it as cash, earning nothing. He could buy land, earning perhaps 4% annually in rents, 4,000 guilders per year. He could lend it to the government, earning 5%, 5,000 guilders per year. Or he could buy VOC shares. At the average dividend rate of 18%, 100,000 guilders invested in VOC shares generated 18,000 guilders per year. 18,000 versus 5,000 or 4,000. The choice was obvious if you believed the VOC would continue operating successfully. And the VOC had proven itself. It had survived storms, wars, competition, and internal problems. Its ships still sailed, its cargoes still arrived, its dividends still flowed. The rational investor chose the higher return. This is how the VOC and similar companies accumulated capital, not through force or trickery, but through offering better returns than alternatives. Investors gave the companies money because the companies made them richer, and the companies used that money to build fleets, establish forts, hire soldiers, bribe officials, fight wars, and control trade routes. The capital from thousands of small investors funded empires that shaped centuries of history. The shareholders mostly lived quiet lives in Amsterdam or London. They collected their dividends. They attended occasional shareholder meetings where directors reported on company affairs. They traded shares when they needed cash or wanted to adjust their investments. They had little direct contact with the violence and exploitation their investments funded. They knew ships sailed to Asia. They knew the company traded in spices and textiles. They received reports about wars and territories acquired. But the connection between their comfortable dividends and the suffering of people on the other side of the world was abstract. They were owners, but distant owners. Beneficiaries, but not participants. The corporate structure created this distance. Shareholders were not personally responsible for company actions. The company was a separate legal entity. If the company committed crimes or caused harm, shareholders were not liable. Their risk was limited to losing their investment. This limited liability was another innovation of the joint stock model. In partnerships, partners were personally liable for debts and obligations. If a partnership failed owing money, creditors could seize partners' personal property to satisfy debts. But VOC shareholders could not be pursued for company debts beyond the value of their shares. If the company failed, shareholders lost their investment but nothing more. Their homes, their other assets remained protected. This encouraged investment. People were more willing to risk money if they knew the risk was limited to what they invested. They did not have to fear losing everything they owned if the venture failed. The combination of limited liability and tradable shares made the joint stock company an extraordinarily effective tool for raising capital. It reduced risk for investors while enabling massive collective investment in large-scale enterprises, and it transformed how exploration and trade were organized. No longer did they depend on kings or individual wealthy merchants. They could be funded by hundreds or thousands of ordinary investors pooling modest sums. This democratized, to a small extent, access to the profits of empire. A shopkeeper with 3,000 guilders could participate. A widow with an inheritance could buy shares. A guild could invest its funds. The returns from Asian trade were no longer exclusively for the very wealthy. Of course, this was limited democratization. You still needed substantial savings to buy shares. The poor couldn't participate, but the middle class could. And they did, enthusiastically. By 1650, owning VOC shares was common among prosperous Dutch families. The shares were considered solid, reliable investments. Parents left VOC shares to children in wills. Trustees invested orphans' inheritances in company stock. The VOC had become part of the fabric of Dutch economic life. Its success or failure mattered not just to a few wealthy merchants, but to thousands of families across the Netherlands. This created political pressure for the government to support the company. The Dutch state protected VOC monopolies, sent naval forces to defend company interests, and negotiated treaties that benefited company trade. Supporting the VOC meant supporting the investments of thousands of citizens. The same dynamic played out in England with the EIC. The company's fortunes affected many families. Its dividends funded retirements, dowries, and educations. Its success was tied to national prosperity. The joint stock model aligned private profit with national interest in ways that individual merchants' ventures never had. When the VOC profited, thousands of shareholders profited. When the company's trade was threatened, thousands of citizens had reason to support government action to protect it. This was a new kind of economic and political power, not the power of kings or individual wealthy families, but the power of aggregated middle-class capital, organized through corporate structures. It would reshape empires, fund wars, colonize continents, and create fortunes and catastrophes for centuries to come. But in the early 1600s, as the model was just emerging, it simply seemed like a better way to organize trade, a way to pool money, spread risk, and share profit. A way to make the economics of exploration work for more people. And for a time, it did. The dividends flowed. The shareholders prospered. The ships sailed. The counting houses in Amsterdam and London tallied the profits and distributed the payments. And the great wheel of commerce turned, powered by the pooled savings of thousands of investors who would never see the lands their money helped conquer. The ships returned to Europe carrying spices and silk. But from the Americas they carried something different, something that would transform economies in ways no one anticipated. Silver and gold, in quantities beyond anything Europe had ever seen. Let us count what came across the Atlantic. Let us trace what it did to the world. In 1519, Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. They found a civilization rich in gold ornaments, jewelry, and decorative objects. The Aztecs valued gold for its beauty and religious significance, but did not use it as money in the way Europeans did. Cortés and his men melted down Aztec goldwork and shipped it to Spain. The initial treasure from the Aztec conquest amounted to perhaps 150,000 pesos de oro, gold pesos, each containing approximately 4 grams of gold. This was roughly 600 kilograms of gold. 600 kilograms sounds like a lot, and it was, by the standards of individual wealth. But for a continental economy it was modest. The European economy at the time contained thousands of tons of gold accumulated over centuries. 600 kilograms from Mexico would barely be noticed. Then came Peru. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro encountered the Inca Empire. The Incas possessed gold in quantities that stunned the Spanish. Temples lined with gold sheets, royal gardens with plants sculpted from gold and silver. Rooms filled with golden objects. The ransom for the Inca Emperor Atahualpa alone filled a room 6 meters long and over 2 meters high with gold objects, estimated at roughly 6 tons of gold. The Spanish melted it all, converted it to bullion, and shipped it to Spain. The conquest of Peru yielded perhaps 50 to 70 tons of gold in the first decade. This was starting to be significant, but it was still limited compared to what would come next. The real transformation came from silver, and one mountain in particular. In 1545, Spanish prospectors discovered silver at Potosí, in what is now Bolivia. The mountain called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain, contained silver ore in concentrations rarely seen anywhere in the world. Within decades, Potosí became the largest mining operation in human history up to that time. The population of the mining town grew to perhaps 200,000 people by the early 1600s, larger than most European cities. The mountain was honeycombed with mines. Workers extracted ore and processed it using mercury amalgamation, a technique that separated silver from rock by mixing crushed ore with mercury. The mercury bonded with silver, forming an amalgam that could be heated to drive off the mercury, leaving pure silver. The process was effective but toxic. Mercury vapor poisoned workers. The mines themselves were deadly. Frequent collapses, inadequate ventilation, exhausting labour at high altitude. Workers died in horrifying numbers, but the silver kept flowing, and the Spanish crown took its share. Spanish law required that 1/5 of all silver mined, the quinto real, the royal fifth, be paid to the crown. The rest belonged to the mine owners and workers, though the crown also collected other taxes on production and trade. Between 1550 and 1650, Potosí alone produced approximately 40,000 tons of silver. 40,000 tons! To put this in perspective, the entire European stock of silver before 1500 was perhaps 7,000 tons accumulated over centuries. In 100 years, one mountain produced nearly 6 times the silver that had existed in all of Europe before the age of exploration began. And Potosí was not alone. Mexican mines at Zacatecas and Guanajuato also produced enormous quantities. Smaller deposits across Spanish America added more. The total silver production from the Americas between 1500 and 1650 was approximately 150,000 tons. 150,000 tons of new silver flooding into the European and global economy. What happened when that much silver arrived? The answer is inflation. Sustained, dramatic, continent-wide inflation that reshaped European economies over a century. In 1500, a skilled worker in Seville might earn 30 maravedis per day. By 1600, the same work earned 60 to 80 maravedis per day. Wages had roughly doubled or tripled. The price of wheat in Spain rose from approximately 300 maravedis per fanega, a unit of volume, in 1500 to over 900 maravedis per fanega by 1600. Tripled. The price of wine, olive oil, firewood, cloth, and virtually every other commodity followed similar patterns. Prices rose steadily throughout the 1500s, creating what historians call the price revolution. The cause was monetary. More silver meant more coins in circulation. More coins chasing roughly the same amount of goods meant higher prices. This is basic monetary economics, though the people living through it did not fully understand the mechanism. They noticed prices rising. They demanded higher wages to compensate. Employers raised prices to cover higher wage costs. The spiral continued. The inflation was not uniform across Europe. It hit Spain first and hardest because that was where the silver arrived. From Spain, it spread to other countries through trade. Italian cities experienced inflation in the mid-1500s. France in the later 1500s. England somewhat later still. The rate of inflation was modest by modern standards, perhaps 1 to 2% per year on average over the century. But this was unprecedented. For centuries before, prices had been relatively stable. Sudden, sustained inflation was a new experience. Who benefited? Who suffered? Debtors benefited. If you borrowed 100 ducats in 1500 and repaid in 1550, you repaid in money that was worth less. The real value of your debt had declined even though the nominal amount remained the same. Inflation eroded debt burdens. Creditors suffered. If you lent 100 ducats in 1500, the repayment you received in 1550 bought less than the original loan had. You lost purchasing power. Lending at fixed interest rates became less profitable when inflation reduced the real value of repayment. Landowners with fixed rents suffered. If your tenant paid you 50 ducats per year in rent based on a long-term lease, that 50 ducats bought less and less as prices rose. Your real income declined even though your nominal income stayed constant. Workers with flexible wages could keep pace with inflation by demanding raises. But workers locked into long-term contracts or guilds with fixed wage scales fell behind. Their nominal wages stayed the same while prices rose, making them poorer in real terms. The Spanish crown was the largest beneficiary and simultaneously the largest victim. The crown received enormous silver revenue from American mines. The quinto real alone brought hundreds of thousands of pesos annually by the late 1500s. This was wealth beyond the dreams of earlier Spanish monarchs. But the crown also had enormous expenses: military campaigns across Europe, naval operations, court expenses, administration of global empire, and crucially debt service. Spanish kings borrowed heavily. They borrowed from German banking families like the Fuggers and Welsers. They borrowed from Genoese bankers. They borrowed from anyone willing to lend. The loans were denominated in nominal terms. The king borrowed 1 million ducats and promised to repay 1 million ducats plus interest. But when repayment came due years later, the real value of those ducats had declined due to inflation. This should have helped the crown. Inflation should have reduced the real burden of debt. But it did not work that way, because the crown kept borrowing more, and because inflation also increased the crown's expenses faster than revenue could keep pace. Military costs rose with inflation. Soldiers demanded higher wages. Provisions cost more. Ships cost more to build. Gunpowder and weapons cost more. Every expense inflated. The silver revenue was enormous in nominal terms, but never quite enough to cover expenses that were also growing. The Spanish crown declared bankruptcy, defaulting on debts and forcing renegotiation with creditors in 1557, then again in 1560, then 1575, then 1596, then 1607, 5 bankruptcies in 50 years. Despite receiving more silver than any government in history, how was this possible? How could the richest crown in Christendom be perpetually broke? The answer lies in what happened to the silver. Most of it never stayed in Spain. The crown received silver and immediately spent it. on wars in the Netherlands, on conflicts with Ottoman Empire, on maintaining the treasure fleets, on administering colonial territories, on servicing debts. The spending meant silver flowed out of Spain as fast as it arrived, to Germany to repay the Fuggers, to Italy to pay Genoese bankers, to the Netherlands to fund the army fighting Dutch rebels, to suppliers across Europe providing goods and services to Spanish forces. Spain was a conduit, not a reservoir. Silver passed through but did not accumulate. By the late 1500s, contemporaries noted that Spain had discovered the Americas, but the rest of Europe enjoyed the wealth. And beyond Europe, the silver kept moving. China demanded silver. The Ming dynasty had recently reformed its tax system, requiring taxes to be paid in silver rather than in grain or labour. This created enormous Chinese demand for silver that domestic mines could not satisfy. European merchants discovered they could buy Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, with silver at extremely favourable terms. China would accept silver at rates that were advantageous compared to European valuations. The result was a massive flow of silver from the Americas through Europe to China. Perhaps half of all American silver production ultimately ended up in China. Spanish silver crossed the Pacific directly via the Manila galleons, ships that sailed from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines. In Manila, the silver was traded for Chinese goods, which returned to Mexico and then to Spain. This Pacific route moved millions of pesos annually. The flow of silver to China had profound effects on the global economy. It monetized the Chinese economy further. It fueled Chinese economic growth in the late Ming period. It created the first truly global trading system linking Americas, Europe, and Asia through silver flows. But for Spain, it meant that the treasure from American mines never translated into permanent wealth. The silver arrived and departed. The Spanish economy inflated but did not fundamentally transform. Now consider Peru more closely, the source of most of this silver. Potosí in the late 1500s was a city unlike anywhere else on Earth. It sat at over 4,000 meters altitude in the Andes. The air was thin. The climate was harsh. No agriculture was possible at that elevation. Everything Potosí needed had to be imported. Food from valleys hundreds of kilometers away. Firewood and charcoal for heating and smelting. Mercury for processing ore, shipped from mines in Spain or from Huancavelica in Peru. Cloth for clothing, wine for drinking, everything. This created an economic boom in the surrounding region. Farmers and merchants who supplied Potosí grew wealthy. Towns along the supply routes prospered. The entire colonial economy of Peru oriented itself around supplying the mines. But the wealth was built on coerced labour. The Spanish implemented the mita system, a forced labour draft requiring indigenous communities to supply workers for the mines. Each community had to send a certain number of men for periodic service in the mines. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Workers were paid, but the wages were insufficient to compensate for the risk and hardship. Many mitayos, forced labourers under the mita system, did not survive their term of service. Those who did often suffered permanent health damage from mercury poisoning or lung disease. The Spanish justified this as a continuation of Inca labour obligations. The Inca Empire had required labour service from subjects for state projects. The Spanish claimed they were simply maintaining the system under new management. Whether this justification was sincere or cynical, the result was the same. Tens of thousands of indigenous workers laboured in deadly conditions to extract silver that enriched Spanish kings and merchants thousands of kilometers away. The environmental cost was also catastrophic. The mercury amalgamation process released mercury into the environment. Soil and water around Potosí became contaminated. The contamination persists to this day. The mountain itself was physically reshaped, honeycombed with tunnels, its surface excavated and scarred. Forests around Potosí were cut for firewood and timber. The treeless landscape eroded. Streams and rivers were diverted to power or processing equipment. The ecological transformation was permanent. And for what? So that prices could rise in Spain. So that Chinese merchants could accumulate bullion. So that Spanish kings could fight endless wars in Europe. The people of Potosí saw little benefit. The miners worked and died. The merchants who supplied the city made profits but faced constant inflation that eroded their gains. The indigenous communities saw their population decline from disease, overwork, and social disruption. The beneficiaries were elsewhere, in Seville, in Amsterdam, in Genoa, in Canton, people who never saw Potosí and never would. This was the pattern of the age of exploration. Value extracted from one place enriched another place. The connection was trade and money flows. The costs stayed local. The benefits dispersed globally. By 1600, the flood of American silver had reshaped the global economy. Prices were higher everywhere. Trade patterns had shifted to accommodate silver flows. China was more deeply integrated into global commerce than ever before. But the benefits were uneven. Spain had inflated but not prospered. The Spanish economy struggled with high costs and declining competitiveness. Spanish goods became expensive compared to goods from other countries. Spanish exports declined while imports increased. This created a trade deficit. Spain bought more from abroad than it sold. The deficit was covered by silver. Spain exported silver to balance its trade accounts. This was sustainable only as long as silver kept arriving from America, and the silver production was not infinite. Potosí reached peak production in the early 1600s. After that, output declined as the richest deposits were exhausted, and mining went deeper into more difficult ore. By 1650, Potosí production had fallen significantly from its peak. Mexican mines continued producing, but the total American output was declining. The flood was slowing. As production declined, the inflation eased. Prices stabilized in the mid-1600s. The price revolution ended not because anyone solved it, but because the silver supply stopped growing. The century of inflation had redistributed wealth across Europe. Old debts had been eroded. Fixed rents had lost value. New money had created new rich families while old fortunes based on land and fixed incomes had declined. The social and political consequences were profound. The rise of merchant classes, the weakening of traditional landowning nobility, the shift of economic power from agriculture to commerce. These changes had many causes, but inflation from American silver was a significant factor, and the lesson was clear, though few at the time understood it fully. Wealth is not the same as money. Spain had possessed more money than any kingdom in history. But the money flowed away, prices rose, and the country ended poorer than it began. Real wealth came from productive capacity, from agriculture that fed people, from industry that made goods, from trade that connected markets efficiently, from institutions that encouraged investment and innovation. Simply having gold and silver was not enough. In fact, it could be harmful if it created inflation without corresponding growth in real productive capacity. Spain discovered this the hard way. The Spanish economy in 1700 was weaker relative to its neighbours than it had been in 1500, despite receiving 2 centuries of American treasure. Other countries, the Netherlands, England, France, had benefited more from the inflation and trade opportunities than Spain had. They had built industries, improved agriculture, developed financial institutions. They had used the age of exploration to build capacity rather than just accumulate money. The irony was complete. The country that owned the richest mines in the world ended up poorer. The countries that never conquered gold and silver territories ended up richer. Economics is full of such paradoxes. What seems obviously valuable, gold and silver, sometimes matters less than what seems mundane. Productive farms, efficient workshops, honest institutions. The silver that flowed from Potosí lit up the world economy for a century. It connected continents, it monetized trade, it redistributed power and wealth across nations. But in the end, it could not buy what Spain most needed. It could not buy productivity. It could not buy institutions. It could not buy the complex social and economic systems that turn resources into sustained prosperity. The mountain at Potosí still stands. The mines are mostly abandoned now, though some small-scale mining continues. The silver is mostly gone. What remains is mercury-contaminated soil, a scarred landscape, and a small city that once held 200,000 people and now holds much fewer. The silver itself is scattered across the world, some in Chinese hoards, some melted down and turned into other objects long ago, some in museum collections, some lost in shipwrecks that still rest on ocean floors. It changed the world, but it did not change it in the way the Spanish hoped. The treasure they sought so desperately brought them wealth that dissolved like morning mist, leaving behind debts and inflation, and puzzled rulers wondering why they were always short of money despite controlling history's richest mines. The economics of precious metals are simple to state, but difficult to internalize. Money is valuable only in relation to what it can buy. Increase the money supply without increasing the supply of goods, and prices rise. The money becomes less valuable even as it becomes more abundant. Spain proved this principle at continental scale. The lesson was there for anyone who looked carefully at the numbers, but lessons are easy to ignore when silver ships are arriving in harbour and royal treasuries are being filled, and the wealth seems so tangible, so real, so obviously valuable. The Spanish believed the silver made them rich. For a time, in nominal terms, it did. But in the end, it was just metal. Useful metal, certainly. But not magic, not transformation, not lasting prosperity. Just metal that moved from mountain to mint to merchant to foreign creditor, leaving behind inflated prices and unfulfilled promises of permanent wealth. The silver moved through economies like water through channels. But silver was not the only thing moving. Another form of wealth was taking root in the Americas, wealth that grew from soil rather than being extracted from mountains, agriculture, crops that Europe wanted, crops that would reshape landscapes and economies for centuries. Let us count what it cost to grow them. Let us trace what they became. The first major plantation crop was sugar. Sugar cane had originated in Asia, travelled to the Mediterranean in medieval times, and reached the Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, in the 1400s. The Portuguese learned to grow and process it on these islands before bringing it to Brazil. Sugar was technically complex to produce. The cane had to be planted, weeded, and harvested within a narrow time window. Once cut, cane deteriorated quickly. It had to be processed within a day or two of harvest, or the sugar content would drop. Processing required substantial equipment. A sugar mill to crush the cane and extract juice. Boiling houses with large copper kettles to reduce the juice to syrup. Curing houses where the syrup crystallized into raw sugar. Warehouses to store the final product before shipping. This infrastructure was expensive. A functioning sugar plantation required capital investment of £5,000 to £10,000 sterling by the mid-1600s. That was roughly 8,000 to 16,000 ducats, an enormous sum, more than most merchants possessed, more than most landowners could raise. But the returns justified the investment. Sugar sold in Europe for prices that made the expensive processing worthwhile. In 1650, raw sugar sold in London for approximately 4 to 5 pence per pound. A successful plantation might produce 100 tons of sugar per year, £200,000. At 4 pence per pound, that was 33,000 pence, or roughly £138 sterling in revenue. Subtract the costs. Labour was the largest expense. A sugar plantation producing 100 tons needed a workforce of roughly 150 to 200 people. These were enslaved workers, purchased rather than hired. The purchase price for an enslaved person in the mid-1600s was roughly 15 to 25 pounds sterling. For a workforce of 175 people, that represented an initial investment of perhaps £3,000. But this was capital, not annual expense. The enslaved workers would labour for decades. The annual cost was maintenance, food, clothing, basic shelter, and replacement of workers who died. Plantation owners calculated these costs carefully. An adult worker needed approximately 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day from the cheapest possible sources: cassava, salt fish, small amounts of other food. This might cost £3 to £5 per year per person. 175 workers at £4 each, £700 annually for food. Clothing was minimal. Rough cloth garments replaced once or twice yearly, perhaps £100 annually for the entire workforce. Basic medical care and supervision, perhaps another £100. Total annual labour cost, approximately £900. Add other expenses. Equipment maintenance and replacement, £200. Processing fuel, firewood for boiling houses, £100. Shipping costs to get sugar to European markets, perhaps £20 per tonne, or £2,000 for 100 tonnes. Total annual costs, roughly £4,000. Revenue of £138 sterling against costs of £4,000 would mean a loss. But the calculation is incomplete. The sugar sold for 4 pence per pound in London, but the planter did not receive that full price. Merchants, shippers, and middlemen all took their share. The planter received perhaps half the final retail price, 2 pence per pound. That would be revenue of approximately £69 sterling. Against costs of £4,000, this would still show a loss. But here the calculation becomes complex because costs are structured differently. The £3,000 to purchase workers was a one-time capital expense. The £900 for annual maintenance was ongoing. The £2,000 for shipping was paid by merchants, not by the planter. The planter sold to merchants at dockside prices. Recalculate. Revenue at dockside, perhaps 2.5 pence per pound, or roughly £104 sterling. Annual operating costs excluding shipping and excluding the initial worker purchase, roughly £2,000. This was still a loss on paper. Why did anyone operate plantations? Because the numbers given above are for a medium-sized operation. The economics of sugar favoured large scale. Larger plantations achieved efficiencies that smaller ones could not match. Processing equipment cost roughly the same whether you produced 50 tons or 200 tons. Spreading that fixed cost over larger output reduced cost per ton. A large plantation with 400 workers might produce 300 tons of sugar annually. The labour costs scaled roughly with output, but processing and administrative costs did not. The profit margins emerged at larger scale. This created pressure toward consolidation. Successful planters expanded. They purchased neighbouring lands. They acquired more workers. They invested in better equipment. The profitable plantations grew while smaller ones failed or were absorbed. By 1700, the Caribbean sugar islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, were dominated by large plantations owned by wealthy planters or by companies. A major plantation might have 500 to 1,000 enslaved workers and produce 500 tons or more of sugar annually. At that scale, the economics worked. The revenue from 500 tons, approximately £260 sterling at dockside prices, exceeded the operating costs of perhaps £5,500, leaving profit of roughly £7,500 annually. On an initial investment including land, equipment and workers of perhaps £15,000, this represented a 50% annual return. Extraordinary by any measure, but these returns required brutal efficiency. Workers laboured from before dawn until after dark during harvest season. The work was physically exhausting, cutting cane with machetes, hauling it to mills, feeding it into crushing machinery, tending boiling kettles in oppressive heat. The mortality rate among plantation workers was appalling. Perhaps 5 to 7% died each year from overwork, inadequate nutrition, disease, and accidents. A plantation workforce of 200 people might lose 10 to 14 workers annually. These deaths had to be factored into costs. Dead workers had to be replaced. If you lost 14 workers per year at £20 each, that was an additional £280 annually for replacement purchases. Planters calculated this coldly. They compared the cost of maintaining workers adequately to keep them alive longer against the cost of working them harder and replacing them more frequently. In many cases, replacement was cheaper than preservation. This was the grim mathematics of the plantation economy. Human life reduced to accounting entries comparing maintenance costs against replacement costs. The sugar plantation model spread to tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, to coffee in various tropical regions, to indigo in South Carolina, to cotton across the American South in the 1700s and early 1800s. Each crop had its own technical requirements and economic logic, but the pattern was similar. Large-scale agriculture using coerced labour to produce crops for export to Europe. Tobacco was less capital-intensive than sugar. It did not require expensive processing equipment. The leaves were simply dried, cured, and packed. A tobacco plantation could operate profitably on a smaller scale than sugar, but tobacco exhausted soil quickly. After a few years of cultivation, yields declined. Planters either had to rotate crops, fertilize heavily, or acquire new land. This created pressure for territorial expansion. The tobacco economy consumed land the way sugar consumed labour. Virginia tobacco plantations in the mid-1600s range from small operations with a few workers to large estates with 100 or more. The economics favoured expansion here too, but less dramatically than sugar. A planter with 50 enslaved workers might cultivate 60 to 80 acres of tobacco. Yields varied by soil quality and weather, but perhaps 800 to 1,000 pounds of tobacco per acre was typical. 60 acres might produce 50,000 pounds of tobacco. Tobacco sold in London for approximately 2 to 4 pence per pound in the mid-1600s, depending on quality. The planter received perhaps 1 to 2 pence per pound at Virginia docks, 50,000 pounds at 1.5 pence per pound, roughly £300 sterling in revenue. Costs were lower than sugar, no expensive processing equipment, just land, labour and basic tools. The main cost was purchasing or maintaining workers. With 50 workers, maintenance costs might run £200 annually. Land costs were minimal. Virginia land was abundant and cheap. Tools and other expenses perhaps £50. Total costs £250 against revenue of £300. Profit of £50 annually, or about 20% return on the initial investment to establish the plantation. Not as dramatic as sugar, but respectable. And tobacco planters faced lower capital requirements to start. This made tobacco planting accessible to more people than sugar planting. The tobacco economy created a different social structure. Virginia developed a class of medium and large planters, rather than the concentrated plantation aristocracy of the sugar islands. More dispersed wealth, more individual landowners, but the reliance on enslaved labour was the same. By 1700, Virginia's economy ran on the same forced labour system as the Caribbean sugar islands. The crop was different. The scale was different. The underlying economics were identical. Now consider the credit system that bound this agricultural economy together. Planters in Virginia or Barbados rarely had enough capital to operate independently. They borrowed. They borrowed to buy land, to purchase workers, to buy equipment and supplies, to cover expenses during years when crops failed or prices fell. Who lent to them? British merchants. The system worked like this. A London merchant advanced goods on credit, cloth, tools, manufactured items, to a Virginia planter. The planter used these goods and promised to repay with tobacco when the crop was harvested. The merchant sold the tobacco in London and settled the account. In theory, the planter paid for the goods with his crop and they were even. In practice, the planter often owed more than his crop covered. Prices might have fallen. The harvest might have been smaller than expected. The merchant might have charged high markups on the goods advanced. The debt carried over to the next year, and the next. The planter became perpetually indebted to the merchant. The debt might grow year after year even as the planter continued working and shipping crops. This system benefited merchants. They had secure customers who could not easily switch to other suppliers because they owed money. They earned profit both on selling goods to planters and on buying crops from planters. Profit on both sides of the transaction. Planters complained bitterly about this system. They felt trapped. But they had few alternatives. They needed credit to operate. Local sources of capital were scarce. British merchants were the only option. The credit system meant that profits from plantation agriculture often accumulated in British merchant houses rather than with the planters themselves. The planters lived well. They owned land and workers. They had status and local power, but they were chronically in debt. This pattern replicated across all the plantation economies. Sugar planters in Barbados owed money to London and Bristol merchants. Coffee planters in Brazil owed money to Portuguese merchants. Indigo planters in South Carolina owed money to Charleston merchants, who in turn owed money to British suppliers. The plantation economy generated wealth, but much of that wealth flowed to merchants and middlemen rather than to the planters who managed production. And underneath all of it, the labourers who actually produced the crops received nothing. No wages, no share of profits, just subsistence maintenance and the physical destruction of working until death. The economic flows were clear. Capital from Europe financed plantation establishment. Enslaved labour from Africa provided the workforce. Land in the Americas provided the resource base. Crops flowed to Europe, profits accumulated in European merchant houses and partially with planters. The enslaved workers received nothing but could not leave. This triangular system, Europe, Africa, Americas, was integrated and mutually reinforcing. European manufactured goods went to Africa and the Americas. African captives went to the Americas. American crops went to Europe. Money and credit circulated through all three. The scale was enormous. By 1750, the Atlantic plantation economy was producing hundreds of thousands of tons of sugar, tobacco, coffee, and indigo annually. The total value of this trade was measured in millions of pounds sterling. The British economy became particularly dependent on colonial trade. Sugar from the Caribbean was Britain's single most valuable import by the mid-1700s. Tobacco from Virginia was second. These crops supported thousands of British jobs in shipping, processing and distribution. British sugar refineries employed workers to process raw sugar into refined products. Tobacco shops employed workers to prepare and sell tobacco. Merchants, sailors, dock workers, warehouse workers, customs officials all depended on the flow of plantation crops. The plantation economy was woven into the fabric of European economic life. Its profits funded country estates, financed industry, and provided capital for the Industrial Revolution that would come in the late 1700s. But this prosperity was built on a foundation of coerced labour and human suffering on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Millions of people working without freedom, without compensation, often without hope, to produce crops that enriched others thousands of miles away. The economics made sense from the perspective of planters and merchants. The returns justified the investments. The system was profitable. That was sufficient reason for it to continue. Moral arguments against slavery existed. Religious thinkers questioned it. Some individuals refused to participate. But the economic incentives overwhelmed the moral objections for most people, with power to make decisions. Sugar was sweet. Tobacco was desired. Coffee became essential to European social life. The demand was real. The profits were real. The system continued because stopping it would have meant giving up wealth and products that had become central to European life. The plantation economy reshaped landscapes. Forests in Brazil and the Caribbean were cleared for sugar cane. The Chesapeake watershed was transformed by tobacco cultivation. Entire ecosystems were replaced by monoculture plantations designed purely for export. The environmental cost was permanent. Soil was exhausted. Forests were destroyed. Native plant and animal species disappeared. The land was used until it was depleted, then abandoned for new land. The cycle repeated. And the social cost was incalculable. Families separated, cultures disrupted, languages and traditions lost, people reduced to property, to assets listed in ledgers alongside livestock and equipment. The accounting books of plantations recorded it all with perfect clarity. 20 adult males valued at £20 each, £400. 15 adult females valued at £15 each, £225. 8 children valued at £10 each, £80. Total human property, £705. Numbers in a ledger. Assets that could be bought, sold, inherited, or used as collateral for loans. The human beings represented by those numbers did not appear in the accounting except as values and costs. This was the plantation economy, profitable, productive, integral to the development of the modern world economy, and built entirely on the commodification of human beings. The crops it produced, sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, became staples of European and eventually global consumption. The wealth it generated helped fund the transformation of Europe from agricultural to industrial society. But the cost was borne by people who never benefited, who worked and died to produce profits they would never share, whose labour enriched others while leaving them with nothing. The economics were clear, the moral calculation was ignored, and the system ran for centuries, growing larger and more entrenched until it finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and the efforts of those who fought to end it. But in 1650, in 1700, in 1750, the system was still expanding, still profitable, still fundamental to the Atlantic economy. The plantations spread across the Americas, the crops flowed to Europe, the profits accumulated, the ledgers balanced, and millions of people lived and died in bondage to feed a system that counted them as costs to be minimized and assets to be exploited until they could be exploited no more. The crops grew, the silver flowed. The ships sailed between continents carrying wealth in both directions, but the ships themselves deserve closer attention, because the ships were not just transportation, they were capital, expensive, depreciating, constantly threatened capital that shaped every economic calculation. Let us count what it cost to build a ship and keep it sailing. In 1500, a Portuguese caravel suitable for exploration cost approximately 600 to 1,000 ducats to build. By 1600, as ships grew larger and more sophisticated, costs had risen substantially. An English East India man, the large merchant ships used for Asian trade, cost approximately £30,000 to £40,000 sterling to build in the late 1600s. That was roughly 45,000 to 60,000 ducats at contemporary exchange rates. 45,000 ducats to build one ship. What did this money buy? Start with the hull. The main structure required enormous quantities of timber. An East Indiaman might be 150 feet long, 40 feet wide, displacing 1,000 tons. Building it required roughly 2,000 mature oak trees. 2,000 trees. Each tree took perhaps 80 to 100 years to grow to suitable size. The timber alone represented centuries of accumulated growth from forests scattered across England. The oak was cut, shaped, and assembled using traditional shipwright techniques. The keel was laid first, the backbone of the ship. Then ribs were attached, forming the skeleton. Then planking was applied to create the hull. This was skilled labour. Shipwrights trained for years to learn their craft. They earned perhaps 30 to 40 shillings per week, substantially more than ordinary labourers. A major ship might require 20 to 30 shipwrights, working for 12 to 18 months. 25 shipwrights at 35 shillings per week for 60 weeks, approximately £2,600 in labour costs for hull construction alone. Then came the masts and rigging. An East Indiaman carried 3 masts, each requiring enormous straight timbers. The mainmast might be 120 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter at the base. Such timbers were rare and expensive. They often had to be imported from Scandinavia or the Baltic, where forests still produced trees of suitable size. The rigging, the ropes and cables that supported the masts and controlled the sails, required miles of rope. Hemp rope in various thicknesses, from thin lines to cables thick as a man's arm. The rope alone might cost £2,000 to £3,000. Sails were made from canvas woven from flax or hemp. A full set of sails for an East Indiaman might weigh 3 tons and cost £1,500 to £2,000. Iron fittings, bolts, nails, chains, anchors added another £1,000. Anchors were massive iron pieces weighing several tons each. A ship carried multiple anchors in case one was lost. Cannon for defence, perhaps 20 to 40 guns depending on the threat level expected on the route. Each cannon cost approximately £15 to £30, plus carriages to mount them. Total armament, perhaps £1,000 to £1,500. Interior fittings, navigational instruments, boats, pumps, and countless other items, another £2,000. Add it together and the total approached £35,000 to £40,000. This was the capital cost, the investment before the ship ever sailed. But the cost of building was only the beginning. Ships required maintenance. Constant, expensive, never-ending maintenance. Wooden hulls leaked. Water seeped through the planking despite the best efforts to seal it. Ships had to be pumped regularly to remove water from the bilges. If pumping stopped, the ship would eventually fill and sink. Marine organisms, worms, barnacles, seaweed, attached to hulls below the waterline. These organisms damaged wood and created drag that slowed the ship. Every year or two, ships had to be careened, hauled onto shore or tilted in shallow water so the hull could be scraped clean and resealed with pitch or tar. Careening was expensive and time-consuming. It might take weeks and cost hundreds of pounds in labour and materials, but it was necessary. An uncareened ship became slower, leaked more, and eventually the hull would rot through. Rigging wore out, ropes frayed from constant use, from salt water, from sun exposure. A ship at sea might replace substantial portions of its rigging every voyage. This meant carrying spare rope, spare canvas, spare everything that might break or wear out during months away from port. The annual maintenance cost for a large merchant ship was perhaps 10 to 15% of the original construction cost. For a ship worth £35,000, that meant £3,500 to £5,200 per year just to keep it functional. Then there was depreciation. Ships did not last forever. The wood deteriorated. The structure weakened. The design became obsolete as newer ships were built with improvements. An East Indiaman might make 4 to 8 voyages before it was no longer economical to repair. If the ship cost £35,000 and made 6 voyages over 12 years, the depreciation was roughly £5,800 per voyage. This had to be factored into profitability calculations. The cargo had to be valuable enough not just to cover the voyage's operating costs but also to cover the ship's depreciation. Now add the crew wages and provisions we calculated earlier. and shipping costs at both ends, loading cargo, unloading cargo, paying port fees, bribing officials where necessary. A single voyage to India and back might cost depreciation, £5,800, crew wages, £2,000, provisions, £1,000, maintenance and repairs, £2,000, port fees, and miscellaneous, £1,000. Total voyage cost approximately £13,800. This had to be recovered from cargo value plus profit margin. If the ship carried cargo worth £80,000 and the voyage cost £13,800, the net value delivered was £66,200. The ship itself, as a transportation service, had captured the difference between cost and value as its contribution, but these calculations assumed the ship returned. Many did not. Shipwreck rates varied by route and era. For the Portuguese India route in the 1500s, approximately 15 to 25% of ships were lost. For later, safer routes with better navigation, perhaps 5 to 15%. Let us use 10% as a representative figure for established routes in the 1600s. If you built 10 ships at £35,000 each, £350,000 total investment, and one ship was lost, you had destroyed £35,000 of capital plus whatever cargo was aboard. This risk had to be priced into the economics. The surviving ships had to earn enough not just to cover their own costs, but also to compensate for the ships that were lost. If 9 ships return from voyages with average profit of £10,000 each, that is £90,000 total profit. But if you lost one ship worth £35,000 plus cargo worth £20,000, your actual profit was £90,000 minus £55,000, equaling £35,000. Still profitable, but the loss significantly reduced returns. This is why insurance markets developed. Ship owners wanted to transfer some risk to others. They paid premiums to insurers who agreed to cover losses if ships were lost. Lloyd's of London emerged in the late 1600s as a centre for marine insurance. Merchants and investors would underwrite insurance policies, accepting premium payments in exchange for agreeing to pay claims if ships were lost. The mathematics of insurance required accurate estimation of loss probabilities. If ships were lost at a 10% rate, the insurance premium needed to be at least 10% of the insured value, plus enough extra to cover administrative costs and provide profit to insurers. In practice, premiums range from 5% to 20% of insured value depending on the route, the season, the ship's condition, and the captain's reputation. Dangerous routes in storm season commanded higher premiums. Well-maintained ships with experienced captains commanded lower premiums. Ship owners had to decide whether to insure. Paying a 10% premium guaranteed that if the ship was lost, the capital would be recovered. But if the ship returned successfully, the premium was money lost. Over multiple voyages, the mathematics suggested insurance was roughly break-even. If ships were lost at a 10% rate and insurance cost 10%, then on average you paid in premiums about what you would have lost to shipwrecks. The benefit of insurance was smoothing, converting unpredictable catastrophic losses into predictable regular payments. Some ship owners chose to self-insure by owning multiple ships. If you owned 10 ships and one was lost, you had lost 10% of your fleet, but still had 9 ships earning revenue. This diversification provided some of the same benefits as insurance without paying premiums. The joint stock companies like the VOC and EIC self-insured through fleet size. They owned dozens of ships. Losing 2 or 3 in a year was a setback but not a disaster. The large fleet smoothed the risk. Now consider the specialized ships built for specific trades. Slave ships were designed for maximum capacity to transport captives. The holds were modified with platforms creating multiple levels where people could be packed tightly. These modifications reduced cargo space for other goods, but maximized the number of people who could be transported. A purpose-built slave ship might cost slightly less than a general merchant ship of similar size, because the interior fittings were simpler and cheaper. Perhaps £25,000 for a ship capable of carrying 400 to 500 captives. But the mortality during the Middle Passage meant the ship was transporting perishable cargo. The economics required calculating expected losses and pricing accordingly. If you transported 500 people and expected 80 to 100 to die during the crossing, you needed to purchase enough initially to ensure adequate numbers survived to sell. This created pressure to pack ships tightly. More people initially meant more survivors at the destination, even if the percentage mortality was higher. The dense packing increased suffering and death rates, but improved the economics from the ship owner's perspective. The moral horror of this calculation is obvious, but from a purely economic perspective, which was the only perspective many ship owners applied, it was rational. Maximize cargo, accept the losses, price accordingly. Treasure ships used by the Spanish treasure fleets were built for security rather than capacity. They were heavily armed galleons capable of defending against pirates and privateers. The armament reduced cargo capacity but was necessary to protect the silver being transported. A Spanish galleon might carry 60 or more cannon and have a crew including substantial numbers of soldiers. This made it expensive to build, perhaps 50,000 ducats or more, and expensive to operate. Crew costs were much higher than merchant ships, but the value of the cargo justified the expense. A single galleon might carry silver worth hundreds of thousands of ducats. Losing such a ship to pirates would be catastrophic. The heavy armament and military crew were insurance against that risk. The treasure fleet sailed in convoy for additional protection. Dozens of ships travelling together, escorted by dedicated warships. This made the fleet a harder target, but created coordination costs. The fleet moved at the speed of the slowest ship. Departures and arrivals had to be synchronized. The logistics were complex and expensive. The Spanish crown bore these costs because the alternative, shipping silver on lightly armed individual ships, would have resulted in massive losses to pirates and enemy navies. Every ship design represented economic trade-offs: speed versus capacity, defense versus cost, durability versus initial price. Ship owners and designers made choices based on the intended trade and the economics of that trade. Let us walk through the construction process of a single ship. Not in theory, but in practice. The shipyard sits on a river near the ocean. Trees have been felled in forests 50 miles inland, dragged to the river, floated downstream as logs. The logs arrive at the shipyard and are stored to dry. Green wood splits and warps as it dries. Dried wood is more stable. The master shipwright examines the timbers. He selects the best for the keel, straight, strong, free of major defects. The keel is laid on supports. This is the foundation. Everything else builds from this. Ribs are cut from naturally curved timbers. The shipwright looks for trees that grew with the right curves. He cannot bend massive oak timbers. He must find timber that grew in the shape needed. This requires searching many forests and carefully selecting individual trees. The ribs are attached to the keel one by one. The skeleton of the ship takes shape. Workers swarm over the structure, drilling holes, hammering wooden pegs called tree nails, fitting pieces together. Planking covers the ribs. Each plank must be fitted precisely to create a smooth hull. Gaps are caulked with oakum, old rope fibres soaked in tar and sealed with pitch. The goal is a watertight hull, though complete watertightness is impossible. Some leakage is inevitable. Months pass. The hull takes shape. The shipyard employs perhaps 50 to 100 workers on this one ship. Carpenters, labourers, specialists in various tasks. They are paid weekly. The costs accumulate. The masts arrive. Enormous timbers hauled by teams of horses or oxen. Cranes lift them into position. They are stepped, mounted into sockets in the keel and secured. Rigging is installed. Miles of rope are measured, cut and attached. Blocks and pulleys are fitted. Everything must be precisely positioned and secured. The rigging is the control system of the ship. Sailors will use these ropes to adjust sails and control the vessel. If the rigging fails, the ship becomes uncontrollable. Sails are delivered from sailmakers. They are enormous sheets of canvas, sewn together from smaller pieces. They are fitted to the yards, the horizontal spars from which they hang, and tested. Adjustments are made. Interior work continues. Cabins for officers, holds for cargo, platforms for guns, storage for provisions, pumps to remove water. Everything must be installed before the ship can sail. Finally, 12 to 18 months after the keel was laid, the ship is ready. It is launched into the river with ceremony. It floats. This is the first real test. If the calculations were wrong, if the construction was flawed, the ship might not float properly or might be unstable. But this ship floats well. It is towed to a dock, loaded with ballast to test stability and prepared for its first voyage. The investment is now complete. £35,000 spent. The ship is a capital asset that must now generate returns to justify that investment. Over its lifetime, this ship will sail perhaps 150,000 miles. It will carry thousands of tons of cargo. It will survive storms, battles, and accidents. It will require continuous maintenance and periodic major repairs. And then, after 12 or 15 years, it will be worn out. The hull will be too weak to trust in storms. The structure will be compromised by wood rot. Repairs will cost more than the ship is worth. It will be sold for scrap. The timber will be salvaged for other uses. The metal fittings will be melted down. The ropes will be recycled into oakum for caulking other ships. The ship will cease to exist. But during its working life, it will have carried cargo worth millions of pounds and generated profit worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. This was the economics of the ships themselves. Expensive to build, expensive to maintain, vulnerable to loss, but absolutely essential to the entire system of global trade. Without ships, the spices stayed in Asia. The silver stayed in America. The manufactured goods stayed in Europe. The ships were the connective tissue that made the global economy possible. They were also the pacing factor. The speed of ships determined how quickly trade could happen. A voyage to India took 6 months each way, a year-round trip plus time for trading. You could not speed this up. Ships moved at the speed of wind and current. This meant capital was tied up for long periods. Money invested in cargo spent a year in transit before returning as profit. The time value of money, the opportunity cost of having capital locked up, had to be factored into profitability. If you invested £10,000 in cargo, and waited a year for a 20% return, you earned £2,000. But if you could instead lend that £10,000 at 10% interest for the same year, you would earn £1,000 with much less risk. The voyage had to return enough to compensate for both the risk and the time. The ships themselves represented time and distance made physical. They were machines for moving goods slowly across vast spaces. They were expensive, fragile, essential machines that the entire global economy depended on, and they were beautiful in their way. The Great East India men with their towering masts and complex rigging were marvels of engineering. They were the largest mobile structures humans had yet built. They were symbols of human ambition and capability. But they were also just tools. Expensive tools that depreciated and wore out, tools that sometimes sank, taking their crews and cargo with them, tools that had to be endlessly maintained and eventually replaced. The economics of ships shaped everything about global trade. The routes taken, the cargoes carried, the profits earned, the empires built. Without understanding the ships, their costs, their capabilities, their limitations, you cannot understand the age of exploration. The age ran on wooden hulls and canvas sails, on the patient labour of shipwrights and the risky labour of sailors. On capital invested in timber and rope and iron, the ships carried the spices and the silver, but they also carried the entire economic transformation. They were the vehicles of change, expensive, vulnerable, absolutely necessary vehicles, and every one of them represented enormous investment, careful calculation, and uncertain return. The ships sailed, the profits accumulated, the system seemed permanent. But nothing is permanent when it depends on monopoly, and monopoly cannot survive when others see the profits. Competition was coming, and competition would transform everything. In 1600, Portuguese dominance of the Asian spice trade was already weakening. For nearly a century they had controlled the sea route around Africa. They had built the forts, established the trading posts, negotiated the treaties. They had been first, but being first did not mean staying alone. The Dutch arrived in force in the 1590s. The first Dutch ships reached Java in 1596. More followed. By 1600, Dutch merchants were trading directly with Asian suppliers, bypassing Portuguese intermediaries. The Portuguese tried to maintain their monopoly. They used naval force to intercept Dutch ships. They threatened Asian merchants who traded with the Dutch. They relied on their fortresses and their long-established relationships. It was not enough. The Dutch had advantages the Portuguese could not match. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had enormous capital from its joint stock structure. It could absorb losses that would bankrupt individual Portuguese merchants. It could invest in larger fleets, more trading posts, longer campaigns to establish market presence. The VOC also had better ships and better guns. Dutch shipbuilding in the early 1600s was the most advanced in Europe. Dutch naval gunnery was superior. In direct naval confrontations, Dutch ships often defeated Portuguese ships, and the VOC was willing to fight. Not just occasional naval skirmishes, but sustained campaigns to capture Portuguese positions. The VOC laid siege to Portuguese forts. It negotiated directly with Asian rulers, offering better terms than the Portuguese. Between 1600 and 1650, the Dutch systematically displaced the Portuguese from much of the Asian trade. The VOC captured Malacca in 1641. Ending Portuguese control of the strait. The VOC established dominance in the Indonesian archipelago, controlling the sources of cloves and nutmeg. The VOC became the primary European trader with Japan after the Portuguese were expelled. The Portuguese retained some positions, Goa, Macau, parts of the African coast. But their monopoly was broken. The Asian trade was now shared with competitors. What did this competition do to prices and profits? Initially, not much. There was still only one European sea route to Asia, around Africa. The Portuguese and Dutch competed for market share along that route, but the total supply of spices reaching Europe was still limited by how many ships could make the voyage. An Asian production could not immediately expand to match increased European demand. Pepper cultivation required years from planting to harvest. Clove and nutmeg trees took even longer to mature. Supply was relatively fixed in the short term, but over decades the effects became visible. More European ships meant more spices reached European markets. More supply meant lower prices for consumers and thinner profit margins for traders. Pepper prices in Amsterdam, which had peaked at very high levels in the late 1500s, began a long decline in the 1600s. The price might fall from 80 guilders per hundredweight to 60 guilders, then to 50 guilders, then 40 guilders over several decades. This was gradual, not a sudden crash, but a steady erosion of prices as supply increased. For the VOC, lower prices meant lower profit per unit sold, but the company compensated by increasing volume. If profit per hundredweight of pepper fell by 30%, but the total quantity sold doubled, overall profit still increased. This was the classic response to commoditization. When profit margins decline, increase scale, sell more at lower margins rather than less at higher margins. But this strategy had limits. There were only so many ships that could be built, only so many sailors who could be recruited, only so much capital available for expansion, and eventually supply would saturate demand. At some price point, European consumers would not buy more spices no matter how cheap they became. By 1650, the spice trade were approaching this saturation point. The spectacular profit margins of 1500 to 1550 were gone. Pepper was no longer worth its weight in silver. It had become a commodity, still valuable, still traded in large volumes, but no longer extraordinary. The VOC and other trading companies had to find new sources of profit to maintain returns to shareholders. They found them, but in forms different from the original spice trade. Textiles became increasingly important. Cotton cloth from India, silk from China and Persia, fine woolens from Europe going to Asian markets. Textile trade involved larger volumes at lower value per weight than spices, but the total profit could be substantial. Tea emerged as a major trade good in the 1600s, growing massively in the 1700s. Chinese tea became essential to European social life, especially in England. The quantities consumed were enormous compared to spices. Where a household might buy a few pounds of pepper per year, they might buy dozens of pounds of tea. Coffee followed a similar trajectory. Initially rare and expensive, coffee became a mass consumption good by the 1700s. Coffee houses spread across European cities. Consumption increased exponentially. These new commodities partially replaced spices as profit centres. But they had different economics. Tea and coffee required massive plantation agriculture in colonies. The infrastructure costs were high. The shipping volumes were enormous. The profit per pound was lower than spices, requiring much larger scale to generate comparable returns. The trading companies adapted. They invested in plantations. They expanded shipping capacity. They shifted from trading primarily in luxury goods for wealthy consumers to to trading in mass-market goods for broader populations. This transformation was slow but fundamental. By 1700, the Potosí was as much a colonial agricultural company as a trading company. It controlled vast territories in Indonesia, where it could dictate what was grown and at what price it was purchased. The English East India Company followed the same path even more extremely. By the mid-1700s, the EIC was governing large parts of India. It collected taxes, maintained armies, and administered justice. The line between company and government had disappeared entirely. This political control allowed the companies to maintain profits even as pure trading profits declined. If you could not earn high margins from trade, you could earn them from taxation and monopolistic control of colonial production. But this required military power, and military power was expensive. The VOC maintained a fleet of warships in Asian waters. It employed thousands of soldiers garrisoned in forts across the archipelago. It fought wars against Asian kingdoms and against European rivals. The military costs consumed an ever larger share of company revenue. By the late 1600s, the VOC spent approximately 40 to 50% of its total budget on military and administrative costs related to territorial control. This left less for dividends to shareholders and less for investment in productive trade. The company was trapped. It could not abandon its territorial possessions without losing access to the production it controlled. But maintaining those possessions required military expenses that reduced profitability. This same trap caught the English East India Company. As it acquired territory in India, it had to defend that territory. Defense required armies. Armies required money. The company's commercial profits increasingly went to fund its role as a government. This was the paradox of success in the spice trade. Early success depended on finding direct routes and securing supplies, but securing supplies led to territorial control. Territorial control required military force. Military force was expensive. Expenses reduced the very profits that had justified the territorial expansion in the first place. By 1700, both major companies were far less profitable per unit of capital invested than they had been in 1600. The dividend rates declined. Share prices stagnated or fell. The extraordinary returns of the early years became ordinary returns comparable to other investments. Some shareholders grew frustrated. They had been promised high returns from Asian trade. Now they were funding colonial governments that happened to also do some trading. But the companies could not easily change course. The investments were sunk. The forts were built. The territories were claimed. Withdrawing would mean admitting failure and abandoning decades of investment. So the companies continued. They expanded their territorial holdings, fought their wars, and tried to find new profitable trade goods to supplement declining returns from traditional commodities. Now consider what was happening with competition among European powers. The Dutch and Portuguese fought for Asian trade. But they were not alone. The English East India Company competed with the VOC. The French established their own trading companies in the mid-1600s. The Danes and Swedes attempted smaller ventures. Each new entrant reduced the potential profits for existing traders. Each new company's ships added to the total supply of Asian goods reaching Europe, driving prices down. This created pressure for companies to secure exclusive rights. If you could monopolize a particular source, say the Clove Islands, you could control supply and maintain prices. The VOC pursued this strategy ruthlessly. It destroyed clove trees on islands it did not control to eliminate competing supply. It forced Asian rulers to sign exclusive contracts giving the VOC monopoly rights. It used military force to prevent other traders from accessing key markets. This worked to some extent. The VOC did maintain higher prices for cloves and nutmeg than would have prevailed in a truly competitive market. But the costs of enforcement were high. Military campaigns to destroy trees and blockade islands consumed resources, and monopoly control invited resistance. Asian merchants and rulers resented Dutch domination. They looked for alternatives. They supported English or French traders as counterweights to Dutch power. The monopoly was never complete and always under challenge. The English took a different approach in some markets. Rather than monopolizing production, they focused on monopolizing transport. The English East India Company could not prevent other Europeans from trading in India, but it could leverage British naval power to dominate shipping routes. By the 1700s, British naval supremacy made it very difficult for French or Dutch ships to safely operate during times of war. The English could blockade enemy ports, intercept enemy ships, and control sea lanes. This gave the English company advantages that had nothing to do with trading skill and everything to do with military power. The competition among European powers in Asia was not purely commercial. It was an extension of European geopolitics. When Britain and France fought in Europe, British and French ships fought in Asian waters. When the Netherlands was at war, VOC trade suffered. The companies could not escape the political conflicts of their home countries. They were instruments of national power as much as commercial enterprises. This military dimension consumed resources and reduced profits, but it also created barriers to entry. Starting a new trading company required not just capital but also naval protection. A small company could not compete with the VOC or EIC because it could not defend its ships against the military forces those companies could deploy. The trading companies had become more like states than like businesses. They had territories, armies, navies, and diplomatic services. They negotiated treaties, collected taxes, and administered justice. The commercial trading activity was wrapped inside a shell of state-like functions, and all of this cost money. More money than pure trading had ever required. Let us look at the numbers for the VOC in 1700. Total annual revenue: approximately 12 million guilders from trade, taxation, and other sources. Total annual expenses: approximately 10 million guilders. Of those 10 million in expenses, military and defence, 4 million guilders. Administration of territories, 2 million guilders. Shipping and trade operations, 3 million guilders. Other expenses, 1 million guilders. Net profit, 2 million guilders. Return on invested capital: approximately 4 to 6%. Compare this to the 1620s, when the VOC was returning 15 to 20% on capital. The decline was dramatic. The company still paid dividends to shareholders, but increasingly it did so by borrowing or by distributing goods rather than cash. The financial position was weakening even as the territorial holdings expanded. By the 1750s, the VOC was in serious trouble. Expenses consistently exceeded revenue. The company borrowed to cover shortfalls. Debt accumulated. The company was technically bankrupt but kept operating through a combination of new loans and government support. The English East India Company followed a similar but slower trajectory. It remained profitable longer by focusing on India rather than the Indonesian archipelago. But it too eventually faced the same problems. Military costs overwhelmed commercial profits. The great joint stock trading companies that had pioneered global commerce were transforming into something else entirely. They were becoming colonial administrations funded by trade rather than trading companies that happened to have some administrative responsibilities. This transformation was gradual and not deliberately planned. It emerged from the logic of competition and control. Each step seemed rational in isolation. Secure better terms from Asian suppliers. Build a fort to protect your traders. Garrison the fort. Expand territorial control to ensure supply. Fight rivals who threaten your position. Expand territory further to create buffer zones. Administer the territory you control. Each step led logically to the next. But the end point, vast territorial empires consuming enormous resources, was very different from the starting point of ships seeking profitable trade. By 1750, the economics of the spice trade looked nothing like the economics of 1500. Pepper was cheap and abundant. Profit margins were thin. Competition was intense. The trading companies were primarily focused on other goods, textiles, tea, coffee, that had replaced spices as the center of Asian trade. The original business model, sail to Asia, buy spices cheap, sell expensive in Europe, was obsolete. Spices were still traded, but they were no longer special. They were commodities competing with other commodities in a saturated market. The extraordinary profits of the early years were gone. They had been competed away by new entrants, eroded by oversupply and consumed by the military and administrative costs of maintaining the system that had initially generated them. This is a common pattern in economic history. An innovation or discovery creates temporary monopoly profits. Those profits attract competition. Competition erodes profits back toward normal returns. The early movers earn extraordinary returns. Later entrants earn ordinary returns. Eventually everyone earns just enough to justify continued operation, but nothing spectacular. The age of exploration followed this pattern. The Portuguese and early Spanish made extraordinary returns. The Dutch and English who followed made good but not extraordinary returns. Those who came later made modest returns. By the time the trade was fully mature, the returns were ordinary. But the early profits had been real. They had funded the infrastructure, established the routes, and created the global trading system. The investors who bought VOC shares in 1602 or EIC shares in 1600 had indeed prospered. Their grandchildren who inherited those shares in 1700 were receiving modest dividends from what had become ordinary commercial enterprises. The transformation was complete. What had begun as adventure and extraordinary profit had become routine commerce and ordinary returns. The economics had worked exactly as economic theory would predict. Temporary monopoly yields high profit. Competition enters. Profit falls to normal levels. The system reaches equilibrium, but the human and political consequences were still unfolding. The territorial empires established to protect trading profits would continue to expand. The colonial systems would persist for centuries after the trading companies that created them had faded. The VOC dissolved in 1799, bankrupt and unable to continue. Its territories became Dutch government colonies. The English East India Company lost its trading monopoly in 1813 and its governmental powers in 1858. The British government took direct control of India. The companies were gone. But they had reshaped the world. They had created global trading networks that persisted. They had established colonial structures that lasted into the mid-20th century. They had demonstrated that private capital could accomplish what previously only governments had attempted. And they had proven that even the most profitable monopoly eventually faces competition. That competition inevitably erodes excess profits. That success creates the conditions for its own dilution. The spices still flowed from Asia to Europe in 1700, but they flowed as ordinary commerce on ordinary ships, earning ordinary profits. The extraordinary age had ended, the age of routine had begun, and the profits that had seemed unlimited in 1500 had settled into the normal returns of competitive markets, where prices are determined by supply and demand, where profit margins are thin, and where survival depends on efficiency rather than monopoly. The age of exploration had taught its economic lessons. Monopoly is temporary, competition is inevitable, profits attract rivals, excess returns decay to normal returns. The only question is how long the transition takes, and who benefits during the extraordinary period before normality returns. For the Portuguese who sailed in 1500, the extraordinary period lasted perhaps 50 years. For the Dutch, perhaps 75 years. For the English, perhaps 100 years. But eventually, for all of them, the voyage ended not in exotic ports with enormous profits, but in counting houses with moderate returns, and accountants tallying increasingly thin margins. The adventure had become accounting. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The age of exploration had matured into the age of routine global commerce, and somewhere in a warehouse in Amsterdam or London, clerks recorded the latest shipments in ledgers: pepper, cloves, textiles, tea, so many tons at such and such price. Profit margins calculated to the decimal point. No romance, no adventure, just business. The transformation was complete. The ships have long since rotted. The forts have crumbled into tourist attractions or disappeared entirely. The ledgers with their careful columns of ducats and guilders and pounds have turned to dust. But the patterns remain. We still calculate risk and return. We still pool capital to attempt things no individual could manage alone. We still chase monopolies that competition inevitably erodes. We still build systems that seem permanent until they dissolve into something new. The age of exploration was never really about exploring. It was about counting costs, counting cargo, counting the price of distance and risk and human labour, counting profits that seemed unlimited until they became ordinary. The people who sailed those ships believed their world would last. The Portuguese thought they would control the spice route forever. The Dutch thought their monopolies were secure. The Spanish thought silver would always mean wealth. They were wrong. But their mistake was honest. Every system feels permanent from inside. We make the same assumption today. We believe our arrangements will continue. Perhaps they will. Perhaps they will not. The only certainty is change, and the mathematics that always, eventually balances. The voyage is complete, the cargo is counted, the ledger closes. Rest now. The economics will still be there tomorrow. The patterns will repeat. The world will turn, and somewhere ships are sailing toward dawn. Thank you for travelling these centuries with me. Sleep well.